Yo, Altus speaking, and welcome to What If Naruto's Body Became Possessed by the Nine-Tailed Fox Finale Part 2. Let the tale begin. As if that weren't odd enough, there was the Yamanaka girl's constant training to consider. If she wasn't squirreled away in the basement of the house, she was outside in her Uma mask challenging anyone and everyone to a spar or, barring that, engaging in a physical training routine that would drive most of her ninja into the ground. May had pulled the reports about the girl from the recent Chunin exams and compared it to what she was seeing now. There were some startling changes, not least of which was that her chakra control was struggling to maintain B rank, down from a solid A, while her reserves had shot through the roof to border on S. Even assuming she had trained every moment since the exams like she was training now, the difference was just too pronounced. And now the Bijou who had point-blank refused to even consider acting as a ninja in any capacity wanted to take a mission. May shook off her musings and motioned to her ANBU. "Bring Naruto here," she commanded. Scene break. Same day. Mizuki's office. -12:00 p.m. "It's a perfectly reasonable request," Kushu said, leaning back in his chair. "I hardly see how there's a downside for you, since you'll get the standard mission fee when we complete the mission." "I'm more curious about your sudden change of heart," May shot back. "Not to mention the fact that you will be acting as a Kirin during the mission, which could be used in a number of ways to damage my village's reputation. Without understanding why you want to do this, I'm inclined to refuse." Kushu nodded as if he had expected that all along. "To be frank, while we could use the money to shore up our funds, it's the experience that I'm after. Ino and I can only go so far in spars, and we need to face ninja in the village to truly be certain that we are prepared for what is to come." "And just what would that be? Is there a threat to Kiri that you haven't revealed till now?" Kushu blinked at her for a moment, then smirked. "I was speaking of our eventual confrontation with Akatsuki. Given Ino's connection with myself, it is inevitable that she will become involved. I merely wish to make sure that she emerges from that event victorious." "Victorious?" May repeated incredulously. "You honestly think that a girl who hasn't even been an active ninja for 2 years is going to win against the host of S-rank ninja Akatsuki has in their ranks?" "Well, not yet, obviously," Kushu replied, that damn smirk growing wider. May closed her eyes for a moment, refraining from rubbing her temples or otherwise indicating her annoyance with the situation. "And just what type of mission were you intending to take, then?" she asked after a few moments. "Missing Nin elimination. As I recall, the Land of Water's many isolated islands are a favored hiding place for missing Nin." May studied the Bijou for a moment, wondering if he was angling for something by taking the conversation in this direction. "There are islands that have no civilian population and are generally left alone, that is true. We hardly allow missing Nin to remain unmolested, however. Which all but admits that there are likely missing Nin to be found, if one were to go looking for them. Assuming I agreed to let you take such a mission, how do you plan to complete it?" May pressed. "Ino and myself will go out, locate missing Nin, kill them, and return to collect their bounties. Simple." May immediately shook her head. "At the very least I expect 2 Kirin to round out your squad. I'm not going to have unaffiliated ninja operating on their own within my lands." Seeing him about to protest, she raised her hand to silence him. "That is not negotiable." A frown crossed his face, then he nodded. "Very well, we can live with that. I will not be under their command, however, they will be observers, nothing more." "And I can live with that," May returned. She fell silent, tapping her fingernails rhythmically on her desk as she considered the Bijou's proposition. In exchange for 5% less of the mission fee, Kiri also gets first rights to any scrolls, equipment, or other items carried by any missing Nin you eliminate. The squad leader assigned to you will make the determination in the field." Kushu thought for a moment, then replied, 10%. 7. 8. "Done," May said. I will have someone bring you the latest copy of the bingo book, and a squad will meet you tomorrow morning to begin the mission. Scene break. June 2nd, 348 NE. Kumogakure, Market Square. -12:00 p.m. And lo, the sacred flame did descend from the heavens to smite those that threatened the sanctity of our newly founded village. With flames of purest white, as white and pure as snow upon the highest mountain top, was evil cleansed from the land. Ugh, don't they ever get tired of spouting this crap? She heard a ninja mutter on her right. She kept her gaze focused on the edges of the crowd that had gathered below, doing her best to focus on her job and filter out the words coming from the group of cultists gathered to the side of one of the central market squares in Kumogakure. The other citizens were going about their business while giving them wide berth, most not even sparing them a glance. And lo, the villagers did cry out as one, giving praise and thanks to the mighty being who had saved our very souls from the perfidy of evil. They cried out, saying, O Sacred One, she whose fire shall burn eternal, we pray to bask in the warmth of your protection from this day forward. And lo, did the sacred flame hear our righteous plea. With the twin flames did she mark the very boundaries of our village. And then she spake, saying, Whosoever dwelleth within the heart of these flames shall fear no evil, for should any seek to harm those under my protection, they shall be burnt unto ash ere the first blow doth fall. So saith the flame, the small crowd chanted in unison. She was unable to fully suppress her shiver at those words. Once, long ago, she thought they were the most wonderful words in the world, spoken by the nicest people she'd ever met. And the sacred flame spake further, saying, Let not those within my embrace stray from the way of the flame. Let it be that ye shall never raise a hand against thy brethren, for no higher crime doth exist in my sight. So saith the flame. They always smiled at her, played with her, gave her little gifts whenever they saw her on the street. Not a day went by when she didn't meet one of them, and she quickly found herself looking forward to meeting them. And the sacred flame spake further, saying, To those within my embrace shall I grant a guardian, my brother, and in each of his 8 arms shall be a shield against the arrows of thine enemies and a sword to strike fear into the hearts of thine foes, and he shall watch over thee all of thine days. So saith the flame. And then, when she was 9, she found out what they really saw. Then they looked at her. And the sacred flame spake further, saying, And to light thine way when darkness doth shroud the land, I shall choose a holy vessel, who shall nurture my fire within her heart as a babe is nurtured within the womb, until at last I return to thee. So saith the flame. The so-called sermon abruptly diverged into new territory, and all of the ninja observing the gathering from various points around the square were suddenly paying a great deal more attention. Rejoice, my brethren! The time of the sacred flame's return is at hand. The holy brethren stir upon the land, and even now men tremble at their works. IWA, the rock that sought to crush our spirits, has been laid low at their hand. Konoha, the tree that sought to shroud us in shadow, has been burned low by the faintest shadow of her flame and now trembles at the slightest breeze. Suna, who sought to drag us into the depths, have fled before the merest mention of her wrath. And Kiri, abandoned by their own guardian as unworthy, will soon drown under the weight of their own sins. And then, at long last, shall the holy vessel bear forth the sacred flame once more, and then shall we bask in the comforting warmth of her flame forever after. So saith the flame, the crowd chanted with significantly more enthusiasm. One of the nearby ninja turned to her from his position on the roof, a wry smirk on his face. Congratulations, Yujito, he said sarcastically. It's a demon. End chapter. Chapter 54, Pulling Strings. June 4th, 348 NE. A small outpost in the land of whirlpools. Tsunade let out a sigh of relief as she closed and sealed the door behind her. She had to travel very quickly to respond to Jiraiya's urgent message, and the multiple days of constant travel had worn even her down. It felt good to be back so she could sleep in her own bed for once. Kushina, she called out, her voice echoing through the small complex of hallways and rooms that had somehow become her home over the last few years. "I'm back." She began methodically stripping off her disguise, welcoming the touch of the cool air that filled the outpost. As she did so, she allowed her mind to drift back to what Jiraiya had told her. Scene break. May 24th, 348 NE. Southern part of the Land of Fire. Tsunade hissed in sympathy as she saw the terrible state of the man's arm. She could see the signs of extensive work that had already been performed, but the skin was still ruptured in more places than not, and by the way the arm hung she could tell there were several breaks in the humerus, radius, and ulna as well. Her gaze trailed down to what used to be a hand and winced further. "I'm surprised you didn't amputate it outright," she muttered, shaking her head. "Did your Mednin think they could actually fix this much damage?" The red-haired man shook his head, his dark brown eyes staring fixedly into the distance. She insisted on making the effort. "It wasn't until Jiraiya-sama came upon us that we held any true hope, however." Tsunade nodded silently, more focused on her scans than the man's reply. The information she was getting was odd, to say the least. "And how exactly did this happen?" she asked. "An accident while attempting an experimental ninjutsu," he said, a little shamefaced. "I thought it was safe, but—" "Must have been a powerful technique," Tsunade said musingly. "It looks like something ripped your arm apart from the inside." The man remained silent, and Jiraiya finally decided to enter the conversation. "Can you fix him?" Tsunade didn't answer immediately, her eyes narrowed in thought. "This is going to take a lot of work to fix, and I'm not making any guarantees. I'm one of the few Mednin in the world who would even have a chance at restoring functionality to your arm at this point, and even then I doubt it will ever be fully functional again." "What is your expected outcome?" the man asked calmly. Tsunade made note of his poise even as she answered his question. 75% mobility, maybe 50% in terms of power. Your chakra network is another matter entirely. I don't think you'll ever be able to channel chakra through that arm properly ever again." That got a reaction, though it was limited to a tightening around his eyes and a slight tenseness in his body. "Is there anything you could do to increase that?" "To be honest, I am more concerned about the chakra network than I am the physical capabilities of the arm." Tsunade activated her mystic palm technique again, running another diagnostic to assess the damage in greater detail. She worked for several minutes, and both her patient and Jiraiya remained silent as she worked. Finally, she looked up and sighed. "Possibly. I'm hesitant to perform the procedure by myself, and to be blunt, Jiraiya doesn't have the skill to assist me for most of it. If my apprentice, or maybe even her apprentice, were present it might be a different story, but we don't have time to track them down." "What happens if you fail?" Jiraiya asked. "I'd screw up the arm even further, possibly beyond repair." "But my life would not be in further danger?" the man asked intently. "No." "Then do what you must. If the chakra network cannot be repaired, there is little point in keeping a crippled arm. Should you fail, I will simply have to seek out other options." Tsunade shrugged and nodded. "It's your call," she replied. "Unless there's anything else, I'd prefer to get started now." The surgery ended up taking over 2 days, split into several sessions. Despite her earlier remarks, Jiraiya did prove to be quite useful as an assistant, though she missed the smooth teamwork she and Shizen had developed over the years. Once everything was finally completed, she left her patient to recover from the surgery while she and Jiraiya moved outside to talk. "So how did it go?" Jiraiya asked. "Did you manage to fix the chakra network in his arm?" "As best I could, yes," Tsunade said, her eyes narrowed. "Now you want to tell me what really happened to his arm?" "What do you mean?" "Don't try to bullshit me about medical matters, Jiraiya. That was not the type of damage caused by an overloaded technique. It looked a lot more like someone tried to turn his arm inside out and then bathed it in acid." The damage was also spread to evenly along his arm, not concentrated around his tenketsu. Now tell me what really happened, and while you're at it. Since when have you been in contact with those orphans from AIM? Jiraiya started, turning to look at her with a surprised expression. Please, pervert, I'm not blind. It took me a while to place him, but the contact lenses gave him away. Someone you know, about 20 years younger, with red hair that color and eyes that they need to hide? It wasn't that hard. That's my Heim, he said, a wide smile on his face. I only found him a few weeks ago, actually. I stumbled across him and his wife while they were holed up, trying to recover from his accident. As for what really happened, you know everything about that I do. Fine, she muttered, crossed her arms. What's the latest word on Naruto? The smile dropped from his face and she felt a ball of worry form in her gut. Yeah, it's still being kept quiet for now, but... He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. He's missing. Tsunade reached out and grabbed a handful of his shirt, hauling him closer and holding him off the ground as he yelped indignantly. What do you mean, missing? She growled. Just that, Jiraiya sighed. Something happened during the invasion of Iwagakure, and both he and Ino Yamanaka haven't been sighted since then. We have reason to believe that both are still alive, but nothing more than that. He was staring her in the eyes as if to convey his sincerity. She held his gaze for several seconds, but his eyes never wavered. Which, ironically, was how she knew he was holding something back. He always tried too hard not to look at her cleavage when he was hiding something. He still hadn't figured that out, it seemed. That's not all, is it? She asked as she lowered him to the ground. He sighed again, then nodded. Something happened to Naruto that day. We only have the evidence left behind, but we're all concerned that his seal might have become damaged. Tsunade swallowed thickly. Meaning what? Jiraiya looked at her again, a pained expression on his face. Meaning that Naruto may not be entirely himself anymore. We won't know for certain until we can find him, but the longer he stays missing the worse it looks. We all hope it's nothing, or at least something small and temporary, but we have to be prepared for the worst. That's... Don't start, Tsuhime. Jiraiya snapped, his tone unusually harsh. Don't think I haven't gone over this in my head a dozen times over. No one wants Naruto to still be Naruto more than me, but we have to face reality. Next time we see him, he might not be Minato and Kushina's son anymore. Why else would he stay away from Konoha without so much as a message? Either he's been captured or worse, or he doesn't want to come back. Tsunade's shoulders slumped as she admitted to herself that the pervert had a point. Has he? Are they going to put him in the bingo book? No, Jiraiya replied as he calmed down. Konoha has decided to issue a reward for information that leads to his safe return to Konoha, but that's all. Thank Kami for that, Tsunade muttered. Tsuhime, Jiraiya said seriously, you'll need to deal with Kushina once she finds out. I leave it up to your judgment about how much to tell her, but if she encounters Naruto and he really isn't himself, she could be in grave danger. The best thing for everyone would probably be to keep her well clear of it until we know more, one way or the other. Scene break. Tsunade steeled her resolve as she moved deeper into the outpost. This was going to be an unpleasant conversation all around, but she'd long since gotten used to talking Kushina down from acting rashly where Naruto was concerned. The two of them would likely begin searching through the elemental nations for any sign of him, but as long as she was there she could keep Kushina from doing anything too reckless. Kushina, she called out again. I've got some news you'll want to hear. She stepped into the training room where Kushina spent most of her time, only to find it empty. The same was true of her bedroom, the kitchen, and the library. It wasn't until she found the stack of recent bounty posters dropped on the floor in the library that she understood where Kushina had gone. Name, Naruto Yamanaka. Description, blonde hair, purple eyes, 3 lines on each cheek, 5 feet 6 inches tall, 14 years old. Rank, AA. Former affiliation, Konoha. Known abilities, medical jutsu, high chakra capacity, commonly uses earth and water techniques, close-range combatant. Reward, 20 million ryo. Condition, dead or alive. Last sighting, at Kazuchimura, Land of Lightning. The poster featured a startlingly accurate drawing of Naruto's face and profile and ended with contact information for the organization handling the bounty. She recognized it as one they had used several times themselves, as they weren't officially connected with any of the ninja villages and were more than willing to work with independents who knew how to be discreet. Fuck! June 5, 348 NE. Land of Wind. Sasori methodically sorted through the numerous reports he had received from his many and varied sources, carefully examining each one for any useful bits of information. His current focus was on the defection of Suna and the fall of the Windlord, an event that was creating shock waves throughout the elemental nation's political landscape. The Land of Wind itself had rapidly dissolved into chaos following the assassination of the Windlord less than a month after the revelations about his callous disregard for the well-being of his people and the rampant corruption that had spread throughout his government. The other nations were quick to decry his perfidy and hold up their own benevolent rule as a shining example of how a true noble should behave. Or how not to get caught, anyway, he thought to himself in amusement. The Land of Earth, on the other hand, had quickly managed to right itself following the destruction of its ninja village. Iwa's loss should have severely weakened their position, relegating them to the status of a lesser nation like the Land of Hot Water or the Land of Birds. Instead, with the acquisition of Suna's ninja force and its Jinchuriki, Earth had managed to retain its status as a major player in politics. Sasori took note of a small missive from one of his more effective operatives in Suna, who sent word that the Jinchuriki was showing increasing skill with his powers and had, so far, still refrained from killing any allies. He had his own theories as to why that might be, though he so far lacked any agents that were directly involved with the Jinchuriki. Another agent sent word that the conflict for the title of Windlord was swiftly drawing to a close as Madarame Murahisa leveraged his massive shipping fleet to control Wind's valuable ports, ruthlessly wielding his economic might to cripple his opposition as necessary. His enemies had swiftly found themselves bankrupted or without resources as he diverted shipments and trade to people favorable to his cause. He had also formed a pact with Tomoki Khan, a powerful noble and military leader who possessed a significant land-based force that would ensure his control over the inland areas of the Land of Wind as well. He nodded in satisfaction. He had agents planted deeply within both of those groups, ensuring that his information network would grow even stronger once they took control of the nation. It would be a trivial matter to insert himself into the process when their plans inevitably turned to the rebirth of Sunagakure. A small frown crossed his face as he reflected on the loss of his birth village. His original plans had called for Suna to revolt against the Windlord as the stress of the village's crippled economy and the Windlord's constant condescension and antagonism grew to be too much. A few key assassinations and a touch of blackmail would have shifted the power in the court greatly, resulting in Suna becoming the power behind the throne with himself as the one pulling the strings for both. The loss of the Kazekage had tangled his plans beyond repair. His mind control seals were delicate creations that required his personal adjustment on a regular basis, and he simply couldn't afford to place them on too many people at once. Left unattended, the bearer's behavior would grow more and more erratic as their mind tore itself apart under the strain. He preferred to use more indirect methods whenever possible, but a prize such as the Kage of a village was not to be ignored. Without the Kazekage, his influence within Suna diminished greatly. He still had seals on 2 counselors, one of whom had lost a great deal of influence because of his opposition to Baki, and the other of whom was well into his old age and unlikely to last more than a year or 2. The more ordinary traders and spies willing to sell out their village were not as highly placed, though they could prove of use as he selected new targets for his seals. Unwilling to simply accept such a major setback, he had changed course and set his agents to sowing dissent within the Land of Wind. One set of carefully forged documents and a carefully timed crisis later, the way had been cleared for the Land of Wind to acquire a new ruler and, soon, a new village that he would be carefully guiding. It would be decades before they could compete with the Great Five, but the benefits of molding the village to his desires from the very start would be well worth the delay. Sasori pulled out another report, this one regarding the newly formed AIM Protectorate. This, far more than the loss of a Kage or the delay in his plans, was an actual threat. He knew very well who truly ruled in the shadows of AIM, and their plans were simply unacceptable. Left unopposed, they might very well achieve their aims, as they already had control of 3 Jinchuriki and would soon regain their 4th. His efforts to delay Kisame Hashigaki in his quest had cost him several agents in grass and sound and had proven to be only moderately effective. That confrontation was coming soon, and while he was unsure who would emerge victorious in a true battle to the death, he fully expected Orochimaru would choose to slip away like a snake in the grass rather than see the battle to its conclusion. Should Akatsuki recover from their recent losses, they would likely turn on Suna next to take control of the Ichibi. Without Konoha to support Suna, it was likely they would be successful in their endeavor. From there, it was a question of whether they would prioritize finding the missing Sanbai and Kyubi or focus on Kumo for the Nibi and Hachibi. Given their newly aggressive stance, he felt that Kumo was likely to be targeted. Not only were there 2 confirmed Jinchuriki present, but destroying Kumo would further the influence of the AIM Protectorate as well. Judging by the progress of their guardians, it would take less than a decade before the newly created Jinchuriki would be ready to take the field. At that point, they would be essentially unstoppable, and more than capable of accomplishing their goal of uniting the elemental nations under their banner. Completely unacceptable. Not that he cared for the current nations or villages, or about the loss of life that would result from the destruction of the other village. No, Akatsuki's plan would ultimately deny him the one thing he truly cared about, the chance to improve his art. Without the constant friction of the 5 great villages sniping at each other, the skills and abilities of ninja would gradually decline, depriving him of valuable materials and opportunities to test his work. Even worse, the linchpin of Akatsuki's plan were the Jinchuriki, whose powers relied on the demons they housed and were utterly useless for his own art. Completely, utterly unacceptable. He rose and stalked from the room, his irritation spilling over into his control over the puppet that housed his heart. He made his way down the hall and entered his lab, throwing the door open with more force than necessary. Quiet down, fucker. I was praying to Jashin to restore my body so I could fucking rip your prissy piece of shit face off with my bare hands, asshole. Have some respect. Sasori allowed his irritation to slide away as he focused on the voice. The bodiless head was secured on a shelf surrounded by a series of ceiling arrays that were constantly monitoring its condition. It had been over a month since it had been delivered to him, but it showed no signs of decay or even loss of energy. He calmly walked over and observed the various scrolls that were recording information about the detached head. They merely confirmed what his eyes told him, there was absolutely no change in its state. Are you listening, asshole? When I get my body back, I'm going to rip your fucking eyes out and use them for dash. Sasori tuned out the voice with practice ease, turning his attention back to the body that lay stretched out on a nearby table. He had initially despaired over the ruined state of it, fearing that it was beyond repair, but as soon as he began reattaching pieces, the body healed on its own, leaving the entire form in pristine condition without any scars or wounds to show for the extensive damage it had suffered. Chakra strings spread across the room, picking up tools and implements of all shapes and sizes before bringing them to hover over the body. Sasori suppressed a shiver of excitement as he set to work. He might soon have to take the field personally to deal with the changing situation, but first, he was going to craft a masterpiece. Scene break. June 6, 348 NE. Land of Water. 6 targets, 2 are listed in the bingo book as B rank, Kushu reported as he returned to the camp. The rest don't even merit an entry. Ino nodded, standing and stretching her back as she began to prepare herself for the coming battle. She paused when Kushu put a hand on her shoulder and leaned over to whisper in her ear. "The one we want is number 7, standing guard on the west side. He's got slick back brown hair and is wearing 2 kunai pouches on his left leg." "Got it," Ino whispered back just as quietly, patting the pouch that contained her sealing scrolls. Kushu straightened and turned to look at the Kirinin who were waiting patiently around the small camp. "Uma will take the lead," he announced, using the code name for Ino that the Mizukichi had decided on, "and I will close in once she gives the signal. I doubt we'll have any trouble, but be prepared to jump in just in case." Ao shrugged and nodded. "Works for us. I'll be interested to see what the two of you can accomplish out in the field." A few minutes passed as everyone made their final preparations, and then Ino slipped out of the camp and stealthily made her way to the location Kushu had described. There were 7 ninja present, 2 of them standing guard in the trees, one focused on a small fire as he cooked what looked to be a trio of rabbits, and the other 4 arguing quietly amongst themselves over some sort of scroll. As Kushu had indicated, her target was one of the guards, which made everything much easier. It took less than a minute to maneuver into position, and then with practiced ease she activated her mind transfer technique and slipped out of her own body to take control of the targets. 30 seconds to make sure no one in the camp had noticed anything, 45 to slip out of sight and then away into the marshy terrain, 7 to prepare a delayed activation paralysis tag from her supplies and position the target's body near her own, 3 to return to her own body just before the tag activated, 1 to pull a kunai and drive it into the target's heart, and 10 to seal the body into a scroll. She was hinged into the appearance of the deceased ninja and back in position guarding the small clearing where his companions were still arguing less than a minute later. She could feel Kushu waiting on the east side of the clearing, the feeling of his Yuki both satisfied and impatient. She pulled a kunai with an explosive tag wrapped around the handle, took careful aim, activated the tag, and launched it at the other guard with all of her strength. She reveled in the feeling of the powerful muscles in her arms tensing and releasing as the weapon blurred across the clearing, traveling far faster than anything she would have been capable of even a few months ago. The kunai flew true, drilling through the other ninja's back and into the tree in front of him before exploding, shredding both tree and ninja and covering the area with burning debris. Kushu entered the clearing a moment later, a swirling ball of chakra in each hand. He lit into the group of 4, killing 2 before they even had a chance to see him coming. Ino dropped out of the trees and landed beside the cook, who was pulling out a pair of sharp knives and handling them with familiar ease as he abandoned the meal and moved to intercept Kushu. He spared a glance for her as she landed beside, her own weapons ready and her gaze seemingly fixed on the melee. "I'll take him from the front," the cook muttered quickly, flipping one knife into a reverse grip. "You get him from behind." Ino nodded tersely, then waited for the cook to take a step forward before driving a kunai into the back of his neck. "Nicely done," Kushu complimented as he approached. His black cloak was covered in blood, and he had several thin lines of it across the mask that covered his face as well. Ino's own cloak and mask were in nearly pristine condition by comparison. She allowed her hinge to dispel, meeting Kushu's gaze with an easy grin. "As if you expected anything less," she countered. Kushu chuckled lightly before turning his gaze back to the ninja they had killed, then looking towards the trees. "And how would you rate our field work, Hunter Nin-san?" he asked, his voice clearly amused. Ao dropped out of the trees, scanning the area with a calm gaze. "Poor," he said finally. "These were hardly difficult targets, but you damaged the one in the trees too much for a positive identification, eliminating the bounty, and the 4 you hit with the Rasengan won't be much use for the Mednin to examine. Only the last target Uma-san defeated was handled appropriately. In my day, a team that came in with only 1 out of 6 targets in usable condition would have been sent back to the academy for remedial training. If you expect to make a lot of money in this manner, I'd say you have a lot of work ahead of you." Ino stared at him in disbelief, wondering if he was seriously trying to lecture them, but Kushu just started laughing, shaking his head. "I'll be sure to keep that in mind," he replied, smirking. Scene break. July 17th, 348 NE. Kirigakure, basement of Kushu and Ino's home. A yellow flash illuminated the basement for a moment, followed quickly by a loud, joyful whoop. "Finally!" Ino crowed, dancing in place a bit as she raised the hand holding the tri-pronged kunai triumphantly. She turned to face Kushu, who had looked up from his operating table to watch her with a grin on his face. "I see you finally managed the Horatian again," he noted. As if there was any doubt, Ino scoffed as she walked over to his side, her expression turning more serious. "Does this mean we're ready now?" "Not quite, but close. The more mastery you have over the Horatian, the better, of course, but we also need to get word to Kanori and have Itachi begin as part of the plan." "What about the Mizukage? Has she bought in yet?" "Itachi's still working on that, but he's confident that she'll come on board once it's a done deal, even if she isn't happy about it. Kiri has too much to gain to not take advantage of the situation." Ino suddenly turned and wrapped Kushu in a tight hug, burying her face in his neck. Kushu's arms wrapped around her after a few moments, one hand rubbing her back gently. "I'm going to miss you, little brother," she said quietly, still not moving her head. His arms tightened around her for a moment. "It will only be for a few weeks at most, Nachon," he replied softly. "I promise." Scene break. August 3rd, 348 NE. Kumovikure. "Holy Vessel Sama," a woman's voice called out quietly. "Please, a moment of your time." Yujito paused, her fork halfway to her mouth before she slowly and deliberately finished the motion and began chewing thoroughly, her eyes lidded as if all of her attention was on the slice of meat she was in the process of consuming. She focused on her meal in front of her, savoring the bite and letting the glowing sun bathe her form in warmth as she sat at her table outside one of Kumo's more expensive restaurants. This was one of her rare days off, and she had every intention of enjoying it to the fullest. Still, there was only one type of person that would address her like that, and the slight quaver in the woman's voice and the awe that tinged her words merely served to confirm it. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the woman was clutching a scroll to her chest, her arms, no, her entire body shaking from barely suppressed tension. Some might have mistaken that as a sign of fear, but Yujito knew better. She would have preferred fear. Yujito's first instinct was to simply continue ignoring the woman, to continue eating her meal without acknowledging her words or presence, but usually they kept their distance. One of them interrupting her like this was unusual enough to catch her attention. Yujito placed her chopsticks on the side of her plate, carefully wiped her mouth with her napkin before placing it off to the side, then slowly turned to face the woman who had approached her fully. She was roughly her own age, perhaps a little older, and wore a simple white robe over dark pants. The symbol consisting of two flames twined around each other that was stitched on the breast of her robe marked her as an official priestess for Kumo's very own cult. Wonderful. Make it quick, Yujito snapped. The woman flinched and immediately folded in half as she bowed deeply. Yujito ruthlessly suppressed the twinge of regret she felt at that reaction. Honestly, these people would be easier to deal with if they didn't make her feel like she was kicking kittens every time she so much as looked at them crossly. "Of course, Holy Vessel Sama," the woman said, still bowing. "The high priest bade me deliver this unto you, that it may guide your path in the coming days," she continued, offering the scroll she was carrying with outstretched hands. Her arms trembled slightly as she held her position, but she made no complaint even as Yujito just continued to stare at her as the seconds wore on. Finally, Yujito snatched the scroll out of the woman's hands and nodded. "Fine," she said curtly, tucking the scroll into her pocket with every intention of throwing it away later. "Thank you, Holy Vessel Sama," the woman said, her face beaming as she backed away, giving another bow with each step. She was moving towards two others who were watching the exchange with looks of awe and pride, no doubt more members of that ridiculous cult. Yujito kept her face impassive as she turned back to her meal, keeping a wary eye on them until she rounded another corner. She'd barely had time to pick up her napkin before another voice interrupted her. Yujito Jounin, the Raikage wishes to see you in his office. Immediately, the ANBU messenger added. Yujito dropped her napkin back on the table and left a few coins to cover her meal before following after the ninja. Interrupted free time or not, it was still better than dealing with those people. Scene break. The Raikage is expecting you, the secretary said shortly, waving her in. Yujito nodded and pushed the door open, her focus entirely on discerning why she had been called in. She found the Raikage sitting behind his desk, his chin resting on his folded hands as he contemplated the man sitting in one of the guest chairs. Kurabi was leaning against the wall nearby, his head bobbing in time to some beat that only he could hear and his lips moving slightly as he muttered one of his rhymes, though thankfully not clearly enough to be heard. The guest stood as she entered the room, turning to face her with a small bow. "You must be Yujito-sama," he said, his voice a soothing baritone. His tanned and weathered face showed an easy grin as his eyes met hers. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "Likewise," she said politely, moving to stand opposite Kurabi. "Chiaki-san has a rather interesting proposition for us," the Raikage said, sounding amused. "Now that Yujito is here, why don't you explain it again?" "It wasn't a request." "Of course, Raikage-sama," the man said. "As I'm sure you are aware, I am occasionally employed by certain parties when they feel the need to work outside of official channels, let us say." The man paused, clearing his throat and glancing around the room. "Could I trouble you for a glass of water?" "No?" "Very well. Regardless, as I was saying, I have been hired to facilitate an arrangement of sorts between yourselves and my client. They have discovered the location of a prominent missing nin, but feel that they are not the most suitable to capture or eliminate said target. In exchange for half of the bounty, they are willing to provide the location of the target to you so that you may do with him as you see fit." Yujito began to see why she had been called to this meeting. She was an accomplished hunter nin, after all, and her status as a Jinchuriki gave her some significant advantages when it came to dealing with the more dangerous missing nin. "Just who is this target?" Yujito asked curiously. "Naruto Yamanaka, Konoha's missing Jinchuriki," the man said calmly, looking her in the eye. Yujito recalled that the kid had supposedly gone missing during the Battle of Iwa, and Konoha was quietly offering a substantial reward for his return, alive. Then word had started to get around about just who this Naruto really was, and his value had shot up overnight as other groups issued their own bounties, with quite a few specifying that they had a rather looser regard for his well-being. She knew for a fact that Kumo was one such group, and highly suspected that Kiri was another. "If you have his location, then you must have seen him, correct?" she pressed, standing straight as her mind started working. "What was his condition? Who was he with? Was he moving under his own power or as a prisoner? Are the rumors that he lost his mind during the battle true? Am I to understand that you are interested in this arrangement?" the man replied, turning his gaze back to the Raikage. "Possibly," the Raikage allowed, glancing at Yujito. "We'll need more information before we can commit, of course." "Excellent," the man said, sounding genuinely pleased. "In that case, I do have some details to offer. At the time he was sighted he was traveling alone, under his own power. I cannot speak to the rumors, but based on what I am told he seemed in good health and perfectly sane." Rather than being reassured, that information actually put Yujito on edge. She shared a glance with Kurabi, who seemed to be following her train of thought as well. "While he is wandering the land, is he still wearing his headband?" Kurabi asked, his words spoken to a quick rhythm. Chiaki Kanaka frowned thoughtfully, rubbing his chin. "I do not recall that being mentioned either way," he said finally. Was he attempting to conceal his identity? What kind of clothing was he wearing? Yujito asked. The man held up his hands defensively. I am sorry that I am not able to answer your questions, he said. I was only provided so much information, and I have shared everything I have already. The rest will depend on your answer and my client's response, although I will be more than happy to convey any questions you have to them. Good, the Reikage said firmly. If your client is serious about this, they'll need to give us more than what we have now. Yujito will prepare a list of questions for you, so wait a few hours and you can be on your way. And unless you have a hell of a lot more information than I think you do, your clients had better be prepared to compromise on price as well. Half of the bounty is ridiculous. Of course, the man said pleasantly, recognizing the dismissal. I'm sure we will all be able to come to a mutually satisfying arrangement. He stood and bowed deeply before heading for the door. I thank you for your time and consideration, Reikage-sama, Kurabi-sama, Yujito-sama. Once the door had closed behind him, the Reikage turned to Yujito. You've heard the reports from IWA and what our spies in Konoha have gathered. Do you really think you could take him out? Yujito nodded. Kill him, absolutely. Capture is more uncertain. I can take a team or two for backup, but it will depend on how hard he fights back. If this boy is as dangerous as they make him seem, you'd better take the kids from my team, Kurabi said. They'll be as ready as anyone can be, after all the training they've done with me. The Reikage nodded in agreement. Approved, and start planning. I'm going to have this Chiaki followed. He's a relatively new name in the information business and I'd like to know more about who he's in contact with. This could all be a plan by the Mizukage to lure us into a trap. Start planning for that, too. Taking out the only competition they have left, huh? Yujito mused. The Reikage frowned. Don't count Konoha and Suna out just yet. They'll be looking to drag us down to their level. This whole thing with Yamanaka could be a trap from their side too. And if it's not? Then we'll make sure that their Jinchuriki stays missing, the Reikage replied with a dark grin. Chapter 55, Bait and Switch. August 4th, 348 NE. Amigakure. I'm telling you, Nagato, there's something wrong with him. And what would you have me do? He has done nothing to harm us and much to help us. He's already made extensive improvements to the seals, even modifying fuzz where we were unable to. And then there's the fact that convinced Tsunade to heal my arm. I can hardly claim to doubt his intentions now. I'm surprised you still doubt, actually. I know that, Conan scowled, turning to pace back and forth across the room. And I don't doubt him, not really, not anymore. But, does he really seem like sensei to you? Doesn't he strike you as a little odd? Nagato's lips twitched. This is sensei we're talking about. Damn it, Nagato, I'm serious, she snapped. You spent just as much time with sensei as I did. Can you honestly tell me that he's the same man you remember? His smile faded and he shook his head. No, he's not. He's only recently had the truth of the QB thrown into his face, however, and it has been many years since we last saw him. People can change. I've had him watched, you know, Conan said seriously, her face grave. I wasn't entirely convinced about his reasons for wanting to get so close to Kyoko and Yahiko at the time, so I made sure I knew where he was and what he was doing at all times. And? He hasn't put one foot out of line the whole time. He barely leaves his workshop as it is, and even then it's usually to work on the seals for one of the children. Well then why are you dash? He hasn't even tried to go near the bathhouse, or the hot springs, or any of the brothels. Not once. Does that sound like sensei? Nagato was silent for several seconds, then slowly shook his head. No. No, it doesn't. I'm worried, Nagato, Conan said as she stepped closer to him, slowly wrapping her arms around him. He's completely obsessed with the defeating the Bijou, far more than we are. He refers to them as the enemy, even. I have no desire to see those things roaming around free, but even Akatsuki doesn't loathe them the way he seems to. I'm worried about just how far he's willing to go, and whether his aims are truly the same as ours. He returned her embrace, his eyes thoughtful. I'll keep my eyes open, he promised. Scene break. August 9th, 348 NE. Amigakure. You wanted to see us, Leader-sama? Fu asked. She was standing in front of his desk with Deidara at her side, torn between curiosity and concern at the abrupt summons they had received. Nagato, though she was careful to always refer to him as Leader-sama whenever she spoke out loud, was standing in front of the large window that dominated the wall behind his desk. The view of the city of Amigakure was stunning, though Fu much preferred the view she had when flying high above the city under the power of her own wings or riding on one of Deidara's birds. She could feel Deidara shifting on his feet. He was standing close enough that his arm brushed against hers as he moved, and she was certain he was doing it intentionally to try and reassure her. They both turned when the door opened and Konan walked in wearing her red and black cloak and the straw hat that members of Akatsuki wore when traveling. She had 2 more hats in her hand, and handed one to each of them as she passed them to stand next to Nagato. The blue-haired woman leaned into her husband and spoke quietly into his ear. He nodded in reply, then turned to face the 2 of them. We have received word that the Kyuubi has been spotted. Fu repressed a shiver at the reminder of the young boy she had met what seemed like a lifetime ago. She had known something was off about him, but to think that he was actually one of the tailed beasts, no, the bijou, she reminded herself, still shocked her. The blond boy, for all that he disturbed her, had seemed so human at the time. She had even found herself tempted at times by his attempts at drawing her towards Konoha, the image of a village that would welcome her presence and not hold her status against her. She wondered just why he had bothered, though, when he had left the village himself less than a year afterward. Had he planned to take her with him? The realization that the bijou were capable of communicating on human terms, that they could actually think at all, had been difficult to accept at first. All she'd known about them during her time in Taki had been the legends passed down through the village about the time before they were first captured, and most of those boiled down to a list of villages and cities that had been destroyed and the hundreds and thousands of people each had killed. Their capture was commonly regarded as one of the greatest acts the ninja had performed for the good of the elemental nations as a whole, and she was supposed to be honored to do her part in keeping everyone else safe. She'd felt anything but honored by the people of Taki, though. She considered trying to communicate with her own bijou soon after that, or at least get something else out of it than a constant pressure to soar through the sky. Nagato and Konan had seemed willing to allow it, since she could theoretically increase her own power by better understanding just what her bijou was like. She hadn't gotten very far before Jiraiya showed up and warned them away from that course of action, even going so far as to alter her seal to prevent that from happening. He was much happier with the seals borne by Kyoko-chan and Yahiko-kun, though he still made adjustments to those as well. All of the guardians, and it was becoming almost too easy to think of herself like that, had found that they had a much easier time accessing their bijou's power after Jiraiya's work. Kyoko-chan had taken to making shapes out of any smoke that was at hand, and when Fu had taken her on a flight she altered the clouds themselves into a vast landscape or rolling hills and forests. Yahiko-kun, on the other hand, still hadn't displayed just what it was he could do. He'd even made a game out of trying to make her guess, dropping vague hints that led her thoughts in 100 different directions. She assumed that Nagato and Konan knew, but they indulged their son on that front and refused to tell her outright. All she knew is that they were constantly suppressing laughter whenever they were around and she was talking to Yahiko. Deidara bumped into her shoulder, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced over at him to see him looking at her with a concerned expression on his face. "I'm fine," she said quietly, shaking her head. The Kyuubi was sighted roughly 50 miles inside the border of the Land of Lightning yesterday, heading towards the northern coast at a very slow pace. We are uncertain what he is trying to accomplish, but Kuma will become aware of his presence soon, if they are not already. Fu glanced down at the straw hat she held in her hands. We're going after him, then? Yes, Nagato replied, nodding. You will not be attempting to capture him, however. The seal used to contain him has some unusual properties, and it is unlikely that we will be able to extract him into one of our own design without considerable risk. Instead, you are to destroy him. Fu's eyes widened slightly, and she felt Deidara stiffening beside her. Destroy? I thought the bijou couldn't be dash. Nagato held up his head, cutting her off. Destroy his body, I should say. That should trigger the banishment clause built into his seal and rid us of his interference for the next 100 years. Should he return after that, Akatsuki will be ready for him. Sounds like I get to cut loose, Deidara spoke up, practically vibrating with excitement. I wonder what kind of art he'll make, Do not be careless, Deidara, Nagato cautioned. The last time he was banished it resulted in an explosion that ultimately turned half of the land of wind into a wasteland. You will have to judge the final blow very carefully. Fu could see Deidara's pupils dilating as he swallowed convulsively, his hands clenching. Yeah, he breathed, his eyes distant. Nagato eyed him for a moment before turning back to Fu. Conan will be accompanying you. You will be responsible for getting the three of you to the Land of Lightning as quickly as possible, as well as evading any problems that crop up after the Kyuubi's body is destroyed. Conan's role will be to delay the bijou long enough for Deidara to prepare his attack, and you will be supporting her in that. I trust you will have no problems? Of course, Leader Sama, Fu replied, bowing slightly. She knew she was the fastest flyer out of the three of them, probably the fastest flyer in existence, but she'd never crossed anything even approaching the distance they were talking about now. She was actually getting a little excited thinking about the challenge this would pose, especially since she would have to carry two other people with her at the same time. Her bijou seemed to respond to the thought as well, the constant pressure ramping up sharply as if trying to force her to take flight at that very moment. Good. You leave immediately. Scene break. August 10th, 348 NE. Land of Lightning, West. Sorry, haven't seen him. Doesn't ring a bell. Blonde, huh? Don't get many of those around here. Purple eyes? What kind of freak has dash? The man's head smashed into the table, shattering his nose and denting the wooden surface. The cloaked figure let go and let him fall back to the floor where he lay groaning in pain, barely able to recognize his surroundings. Hey, what the fuck are you dash? The other men sitting at the table began to shout. Sit down and shut up, you idiots, the bartender roared, cutting through the swiftly rising din. An awkward silence fell over the room, several men freezing, half risen out of their chairs, before slowly sitting back down. The cloaked ninja looked over at the one who had shouted, the gloved hand that had moved so quickly it was almost invisible falling back to once more lie concealed within the dark cloak he wore. His face was covered by a bone-white mask that bore no decorations or marks except for the dark red lines that surrounded the eyes. There was a large sword strapped to his back as well, nearly as tall as the ninja himself. Look, Ninja-san, we don't want any trouble, the bartender continued calmly, raising both of his hands in a surrendering gesture. We'll do our best to answer any questions you got, so just leave us in peace afterwards, yeah? I'm looking for a boy, the ninja said, the distorted voice carrying throughout the quiet bar. He held out his hand, palm down, even with his own neck. He's about this tall, has blonde hair, purple eyes, and 3 lines on each cheek that look like birthmarks. He may have had a ninja headband on somewhere as well. Any of you sorry lot seen someone like that? The barman called out, his eyes scanning the room. One of the men near the back slowly stood up, a large smirk on his face. I might have seen something, he drawled. Then again, I might not. You ninjas are rich, right? I figure a bit o' money might jog my memory some, yeah? He started to chuckle before the sound of metal coins banging against each other rang out loud and clear. He looked down to see a bag lying at his feet, a mixture of silver and gold coins spilling out of the top. He looked back up to see the masked ninja less than a foot away, the small opening that served as the eyes and the ninja's mask boring down on him with palpable intensity. "Speak," the distorted voice came, causing a shiver to run down his spine. Why yeah, I seen him. I was, out huntin' when I saw him, about 3 days ago, just strollin' down the road like he ain't got a care in the world. I didn't see no headband or nothin', but he had blonde hair and marks on his cheeks, just like you said." "Where?" "'Bout halfway between here and the next village, near where the river turns and all those rocks are juttin' out. The main road runs right past it, can't miss it." "Which way was he headed?" The man's eyes grew distant for a moment, then he nodded. "North." "Yeah, he was headed north." The ninja's form blurred for a moment, and then he was gone like he'd never been there in the first place. Scene break. August 11th, 349 NE. Reikage's office, Kumobikure. "I am very pleased to hear that, Reikage-sama. My clients have been eagerly awaiting your decision, and they will be dash." "Cut the crap," the Reikage interrupted, scowling. Chiaki shifted uncomfortably for a moment, clearing his throat roughly. Yes, well. Our latest information on the target indicates that he has been moving in a generally northern direction for the past month, and was last sighted near the windswept valley. He has generally avoided contact with anyone but will occasionally enter a town or settlement to gather supplies. He stated it in roughly 2 weeks ago, disguised, of course, but one of my client's agents recognized him and reported it. We've been following his trail ever since." The Reikage drummed his fingers on his desk, fixing Chiaki with a dark glare. "Near the windswept valley, a week ago. Do you understand just how quickly ninja can travel, Konoha-san? A week is a very long time to a ninja." Chiaki shifted in his seat again, his gaze flickering to Yujito and Kurabi, who were both watching him silently, blank expressions on their faces. I do understand that, Reikage-sama," he stuttered, beads of sweat appearing on his forehead. He gulped nervously when the Reikage began leaking a small amount of killing intent. "I do," he repeated quickly. But the target has been moving slowly for some reason. My client's agents have been able to keep up with him without exposing themselves." The killing intent grew a little heavier as tension filled the room, all of it focused on Chiaki. He's been traveling alone, always. He hasn't bought anything except food and supplies. He keeps going into bookstores and craft stores, but never buys anything there. That's everything we know." The killing intent spiked for a moment before slowly disappearing. The Reikage leaned back, allowing a small sigh to escape his lips. "I suppose that's the best we can expect from a bunch of civilians," he said finally, shaking his head slightly. "We'll take it from here, Konoha-san. I just hope that your information is still accurate, for your sake. Talk to Saya to get your money." Chiaki stood from his chair shakily, trying to cover his lack of control by repeatedly bowing as he moved towards the door. "Of course, Reikage-sama." "Thank you, Reikage-sama. We look forward to hearing of your success, Reikage-sama." The three ninja watched silently as he left and closed the door behind him, still thanking the Reikage with every step. Once he was gone, they exchanged glances. "He withstood your killing intent like he didn't know what it meant," Kurabi pointed out, folding his arms back over his chest. "He tried to play the fool, but inside he was a little too cool." "What did the ninja who followed him say?" Yujito asked. "That everything checked out up to the point they lost him in Shinatsugai," the Reikage replied. "Supposedly he walked into the middle of a crowded square and just vanished." Yujito blinked in surprise. "They lost a civilian?" The Reikage grunted softly. "He acts like a civilian, but I have my doubts." Should we be a little more forceful about it, then? The Raikage leaned back, rubbing his goatee thoughtfully before finally shaking his head. Everything else about him checked out. It wouldn't be the first time a missing nin tried to pass himself off as a civilian, and as long as he's not one of ours, I don't really care. Of course, if the information he just sold us doesn't check out. If he tries to make off with our bling, we'll just have to make him sing, Kurama burst out, nodding to himself. Both Yujito and the Raikage stifled a grimace at that. So, the windswept valley, Yujito continued quickly. I can have my team there in 20 hours if we push. Do it, the Raikage ordered. I want regular updates as you search. If a week passes and there's no sign of him, send word, then report to Shinatsugai to await further orders. Yes, sir. Scene break. August 12th, 348 NE. Land of Lightning, Northwest. Kushina felt like her heart was going to burst out of her chest when she finally caught sight of her son. Just like the various civilians had reported, he was walking down the road at a relaxed pace, his hands tucked behind his head and a bored expression on his face. His blonde hair, so much like his father's, had grown out enough that the spikes on his head were starting to droop a little, and without the headband to keep them contained, she could see the beginnings of the long bangs Minato had favored. She crossed the remaining distance in a single movement, coming to a stop a few feet in front of her son and doing everything she could to resist sweeping him up into a crushing hug. Naruto looked wary at first, dropping into a defensive stance and pulling out a kunai before his dark purple eyes narrowed and studied her form more closely. She quickly pulled off her mask and pushed back the hood of her cloak, revealing her smiling face to him. Kushika-san? Naruto asked, shocked. How why are you here? I found out about the bounty on you, Naruto-kun, she said, stepping closer. I came as soon as I could. Now that I've found you, I can take you back with me to where I've been staying. She swallowed thickly, blinking away the tears that were forming in her eyes. I can finally take you home. Naruto stared at her, apparently unable to process what she was saying. Ka-san, you can't be here right now. Kushina's eyes widened in panic. What? Is something wrong? Has someone else already found you? Her heart clenched painfully as the traitorous thought entered her mind. Do you not want to dash? What? No! I mean, I'd love to go with you, Ka-san, Naruto said quickly, stepping forward and laying one hand on her arm. It's just, there's a reason I'm here, and it's very important that I remain here until my job is complete. Kushina let out a relieved breath as the tension in her chest eased. It wasn't that her son didn't want to go with her, but that he was on a mission. She was a ninja herself, she could understand that. Let me help you, then. Between the two of us it will go much easier. She smiled again as she reached out to caress his hair gently. It'll be our first mission together, mother and son. Naruto stared up at her, his eyes wide. Ka-san, he said softly. Then he shook his head, frowning. It's too dangerous. I only just got you back, and I don't want to lose you again, he insisted. Kushina couldn't help the large smile that bloomed across her face. Here was yet more confirmation that her son cared about her, wanted to see her safe. Of course, if his mission was dangerous enough that he would worry about someone else, then there was no way she was ever going to leave him to face it alone. I think you'll find that your mother is a lot stronger than you think, Naruto-kun, she told him. And everyone needs someone to watch their back. Scene break. August 12th, 348 NE. Land of Lightning, Northwest. That sword, no mistake. Not many ninja run around with an odachi and throw in the full cloak and blank ANBU mask? Samui commented softly, lowering the spyglass. Oh man, Omoi moaned, dropping into a crouch. I've heard he's S-class. He's gonna make off with our target, and then we'll chase after him but run into an ambush from his partner. We'll get held up fighting him and lose sight of the Jinchuriki, and then Kiri will get hold of him and use him to launch an invasion that dash. Shut up, Yujito hissed. This isn't the time. She turned back to Samui. What's happening? Is there any sign of Hammer? No, looks like it's just him. He's moving pretty fast, and looks like he's looking for something. Wait, alright, he's just made contact with the Jinchuriki. I told you! Omoi called out. No fighting yet, Samui said after a moment. Our target's pulled out a kunai, but Sword hasn't responded. Trying for intimidation, maybe? On a Jinchuriki? Good luck with that, Karui snorted, amused. Still no sign of Hammer, or any other ninja, Samui continued. I see two options, Yujito said after a moment. Either Sword is trying to catch him off guard, or he's trying to recruit our target. If it's the former, I'd be perfectly happy to let them fight it out and strike once they're weakened, but if it's the latter, that may not be an option. Or Sword could be delaying in order to allow Hammer time to catch up. They always work as a team, from the reports, Karui pointed out calmly, once more looking through the spyglass. Yujito nodded thoughtfully. Worst case, Hammer shows up and the Jinchuriki agrees to join up with them. If that happens, dash. Huh. Sword is a woman, Samui interrupted, her voice surprised. All three of her companions turned to look at her. What? Karui asked blankly. Sword is a woman. A redhead, in fact. Yujito stiffened, her mind racing. She's supposed to be dead, she blurted out. The focus of the group turned to center on her. Who is? Karui asked as she silenced Omoi's mutterings about zombies. Kushina Uzumaki. She was one of Konoha's strongest ninja when I was still a student. I remember my Kenjutsu teacher praising her as one of the best sword wielders outside of Kumo. He was especially impressed with how well she handled the Nodachi that she favored. She was supposed to have died when the Kyuubi attacked Konoha. It's a setup, Omoi declared, holding his head in his hands. Konoha has planted one of their strongest ninja deep into the ranks of the missing need so that they can use her to disrupt the other villages without anyone catching on. And now they're doing the same thing with their Jinchuriki. She's going to interfere with whoever tries to capture him, and then they'll work together to whittle down all the teams sent after him until they've killed every ninja from a village other than Konoha, at which point they'll dash. I can't believe I'm going to say this, Yujito muttered, but he has a point. This is a little too convenient. If that really is Kushina Uzumaki, Karui countered. All we have is that Sword is female, a redhead, and carries a Nodachi. That's hardly confirmation. You honestly think it's just a coincidence? Samui asked in disbelief. Karui shrugged and turned back to Yujito. What's the call, leader? We wait and see, Yujito said firmly. It's a little odd that they would talk so openly if this really is a setup, but that's the only thing that makes sense at this point. I'm going to send word to the Raikage about this and see if he wants to expand the mission or not. Taking out a single Jinchuriki with no support is one thing, taking on one or more S-class ninja on top of that is more than we're prepared for. If we're going to face all of them at once, we'll need reinforcements. Scene break. August 12th, 348 NE. Land of Lightning, Northwest. So what is this mission, anyway? Kushina asked as they began to walk down the road. She hadn't succeeded in convincing Naruto to come with her yet, but it was only a matter of time. Until then, she was content to stick by his side until he came around. I can't really talk about it, Kaa-san, Naruto replied evasively, still looking uncomfortable. Who gave you the mission, then? Was it Konoha? Her face darkened. Did that bastard Sarutobi really send you out alone? Is he trying to get you killed, is that it? What? Naruto yelped.
No!
Sarutobi-sama would never do that, and besides, Shikaku-jizan is the Hokage now. But they did send you out? Kushina pressed.
No.
Naruto answered more seriously as he recovered from his shock. This mission doesn't have anything to do with Konoha. I'm a freelancer now, just like you. He sounded a little wistful when he said it. Kushina couldn't help the grin that spread across her face at that, and she reached out to pull her son into a sideways hug. And I'm sure you'll do great. With Tsunade and I showing you the ropes, you'll be on your feet before you know it. She laughed lightly, and reveled in the sound of it, the feeling of it. She had precious few reasons to laugh since that night, but everything was finally coming together, becoming the way it should have been all along. Hopefully you get a better name than Sword, she added. Tsunade still can't stand the fact that we got stuck with those, and she's half convinced that Jiraiya had something to do with it. Hopefully, Naruto replied, smiling. I've got a few names in mind, but it all depends on how things turn out, I guess.
Oh?
Kushina asked, delighted that she was successfully drawing Naruto into a conversation. She was also proud of herself for keeping a tighter rein on her emotions this time. She hadn't even shed a tear yet, though she'd come close when she first caught sight of him. Any names you care to share? Not yet, Naruto answered. A lot of them are meant to describe a pair of people, after all. Kushina nodded. And how is Ino-chan, anyway? Is she back in Konoha still? Naruto snorted in amusement and shook his head. Like hell he stopped abruptly, a frown crossing his face before he shook his head. Like hell I'd leave her behind, he continued, his turning casually from side to side as his eyes flickered back and forth, rapidly scanning the area. Kushina recognized that kind of mannerism and started paying much more attention to her own senses while keeping her demeanor casual. After a few seconds she noted the faintest traces of something, likely the same thing that her son had noticed. Is she part of this mission, then? She asked casually, turning to look directly at Naruto and sweeping her eyes along the path behind him. In a way, Naruto replied distractedly, a small frown on his face as his nose crinkled. He inhaled deeply several times, a slight frown crossing his face. Kushina breathed in deeply as well, focusing on any sense in the surrounding area. Nothing stood out to her, but perhaps her son's senses were sharper than her own. Will I get a chance to meet her? She continued, her eyes and ears still studying their surroundings intently. She shrugged her shoulders casually, checking the weight of her nodachi and ensuring that the sheath was still firmly attached to her back at the proper angle. I've heard so much about her over the years, I feel like she's just as much part of my family as you. Naruto looked over at her, a wide grin on his face, and Kushina knew she'd said the right thing. She meant it, to a point, but she was also aware just how close Ino was to her son and wanted to make sure that he didn't think she would try to separate them or anything equally foolish. I know she'd love to meet you as well, Ka-san, Naruto said. His nose twitched again, and for a moment it looked like he was about to sneeze. Do you smell that? He asked. It's like something is burning. Kushina reflexively pushed chakra into her lungs, instinctively filtering out any possible toxins or other substances that could have been added to the air. After several seconds she relaxed. There was no reaction that the technique was encountering anything beyond the typical mixture of pollen and other substances that were normally found outside. She finally shook her head. I don't smell anything, and it doesn't seem like there's anything strange in the air either. After a moment, he shrugged. I guess it's nothing. Scene break. August 12th, 348 NE. Land of Lightning, West. Fu! Deidara called out, shaking her shoulder roughly. Fu languidly turned her head towards him, a soft grin on her face. Yeah, she asked, struggling to focus through the euphoric fog that filled her entire body. He frowned at her, snapping his fingers in front of her face. Come on, Fu, stick with me, She reached out and grabbed a handful of his shirt. I'm with ya, baby. All night, she drawled, giggling and tugging on his shirt. Hey, can you do that thing with your dash? Fu, he snapped, frowning harshly. This isn't the time, She pouted at him for a moment, then squeezed her eyes shut and pressed her hands against her temples, struggling to concentrate. Sorry, she forced out after a minute. We were. She trailed off, frustrated. Preparing to assault a bijou? Conan finished shrilly, her voice thoroughly unamused. She looked over at Deidara, frowning. This is much worse than it was last night. Are you sure she's up for this? She'll be fine, Deidara said defensively, pulling Fu to her feet. She swayed unsteadily for a moment before leaning against him, her arms wrapping around him and holding tight. After a moment, her hands started to wander and Deidara yelped, grabbing her arms and holding them in place. Clearly, Conan muttered. You were the one who insisted we keep pushing, Deidara shot back even as he looked into Fu's eyes, trying to determine just how bad off she was. And you are well aware of the reasons for our haste, as was she, Conan countered. She stepped closer, observing Fu's demeanor for several seconds. Has she ever gotten like this before? No, Deidara replied, cupping Fu's cheek and studying the dilation of her pupils. She giggled in response, her head turning as she tried to lick his palm. I know she gets a thrill from flying, but so do we, This is something else, What's the longest she's continually pulled on the Nanabi's power before this? Deidara frowned as he searched his memory, pulling Fu into a soft embrace and rubbing his hand up and down her back as he did so. Maybe an hour, Conan stepped closer, holding Fu's head in her hands and studying her expression closely. Fu, she said sharply, has this ever happened to you before? Fu frowned, then nodded slowly. I think, there was this one time when Deikuin took me out near this beautiful waterfall and we kept going at it for hours, she finished, her expression glazed as another giggle escaped her lips. Conan growled in disgust and dropped her hands, ignoring the faint blush on Deidara's cheeks. She's useless like this, she scoffed, shaking her head. It's not her fault, Deidara said. She got us here days before either of us could have made it on our own, and you know it, I'm well aware of that, she answered. Regardless, we can't execute the plan while she's drifting between completely out of it and trying to feel you up. She looked pensive for a moment, then sighed and nodded to herself, pulling out a small, intricate tag. It can't be helped, she decided, slapping the tag on Fu's back. Fu's eyes widened for a moment before she convulsed, her eyes rolling up until they were completely white and her body shaking uncontrollably. She was completely unresponsive to Deidara's panicked cries, and she finally collapsed limply into his arms several seconds later, her eyes drifting closed and her breathing evening out. What did you just do? Deidara snarled, whirling on Conan. Cut her off from the Nanabi's power completely, Conan replied calmly, meeting Deidara's furious gaze without concern. We can't continue without her, and this is likely the fastest way to get her back in her right mind. You could have warned her, he said, though a lot of the heat had gone out of his voice. She was in no condition to understand or agree to anything, Conan said dismissively, already turning away. We'll remove the tag in a few hours and determine her state then. In the meantime, you watch over her while I start looking for our target. With that, her pure white wings flared out and pushed down powerfully, launching her into the air before Deidara could reply. Scene break. August 14th, 348 NE. Land of Lightning, Northwest. They're trying to lure us into a trap, that's it, Omoi muttered lowly as the team from Kumo observed their quarry from the distance. The moment we close and Hammer will pop up out of nowhere and kill one of us, while Sword and the Jinchuriki will join forces to take on the rest of us. They'll leave Yujito-senpai alive, though, as they're probably planning to use her tailed beast for an evil plot involving Dash. His rant was cut off as Karui cuffed him on the back of his head, a harsh glare on her face. "Not everything is a trap, you idiot. That's what they want you to think," he shot back with a glare of his own. Samui and Yujito ignored them with an ease born of long suffering, instead consulting quietly about how they should approach the situation. "They seem to be settling in for the night," Samui noted, frowning slightly. "Still no sign of Hammer or any other ninja, and they haven't done anything that would indicate they were signaling another group or leaving signs for someone to follow." Yujito nodded in agreement, which would suggest that they are planning to meet with someone at a prearranged location. Pretty soon they'll be moving further away from Kumogakure and approaching the coast, so they could be planning to take a ship somewhere. Samui shrugged, reaching up to rub one of her shoulders tiredly. "They've been walking in the open the entire time, though. To be honest, it's really starting to get to me." "I know what you mean," Yujito muttered, glancing into the distance where Naruto and the ninja known as Sword had set up a small camp about a mile away from the main road. "They're barely traveling faster than the average civilian, and they haven't bothered to hide themselves or avoid being seen the whole time. He's practically announcing his presence." "But why?" groaned Samui. "It doesn't make any sense. If he's acting as bait, where are the other ninja? If they're around and we've completely failed to spot them, what's stopping them from taking us out right now?" Yujito's reply was interrupted when a small eagle landed nearby, a tightly rolled scroll clutched in its claws. It let out a low cry before sticking out its leg towards Yujito. Yujito took the scroll quickly, unrolling it and scanning the contents while her team gathered around her. She didn't say anything for several moments, instead pulling out a brush from her pack and making a series of short notations on the scroll. She rolled it back up, secured it to the bird's leg, and sent the bird on its way. "Well?" Karui asked. "What did the Raikage say?" "He's dispatched 2 ANBU teams to stand by at the windswept east outpost. We are to make contact with them and then launch our attack on the targets as soon as possible thereafter," Yujito reported, her eyes closing for a moment. She drew in a deep breath. "Karui, Darui, you two head to the outpost and lead the teams to the base of that hill on the far side of the target's camp," Yujito said, pointing into the distance. "Once I have confirmed your arrival, I will begin the assault myself. You two and the other teams will be responsible for Sword. I will focus on the Jinchuriki, and Samui will provide backup for either group as needed. Above all, make sure that Sword is not able to link up with or assist the Jinchuriki. We don't know much about Sword's skills or techniques, but expect a high degree of mastery over her Nodachi at the very least. Sword has been listed as S-rank for the last 5 years, and if she really is Kushina Uzumaki, she's been that good for at least twice that long. You'd better approach that fight as if Kurabi himself was coming at you for real." Karui and Omoi nodded solemnly, their expressions grim. Yujito looked at each of them in turn, noting that their eyes were unwavering and steely as they returned her gaze. "You three better survive this, or Kurabi is going to kick my ass." The three of them snorted in unison, a bit of the tension leaving their frames for a moment. "That's all," Yujito said finally. "Move out." Scene break. August 14th, 348 NE. -3:20 AM. Land of Lightning, Northwest. Yujito placed her pack and cloak in a small hollow at the base of the tree, making sure everything was well concealed and that she had a clear grasp of the location. That task done, she turned and began walking through the trees towards the camp her target had established. Her bare feet patted over the loose leaves and twigs silently, making not a single whisper of sound as she moved. The cool air whispered across her skin, the first hints of autumn making themselves known in the land of lightning. The sounds of the forest, the chattering of the insects, the small barks and cries of animals gradually faded away as the wildlife fled, sensing the events about to occur with a prescience that never failed to amuse her. No ninja had ever shown half as much sense, after all. She breathed in deeply, her heart beginning to beat faster in anticipation. She shifted her focus inward, pushing her chakra towards that place within herself where it waited, coiled and patient as a bank furnace. A rush of heat swept through her, banishing the chill of the night in an instant as sweat began to seep from her pores. She pushed more chakra towards it, raising the heat higher and higher until she felt as if she were about to set herself ablaze. Then, with a smooth motion born of long years of practice, she pulled all of her chakra away from it. For a moment everything hung in perfect balance, the night deathly quiet and the stars sparkling high overhead as her gaze fell onto the distant side of the camp where her quarry lay resting. Then fire exploded from her form, setting the nearby trees ablaze and reducing the loose shirt and shorts she had been wearing to so much ash, then burning the ash itself away until nothing remained. She herself hung suspended in the middle of the firestorm, the flames flowing out of her, into her, through her, permeating her lungs, her muscles, her very being, and yet not singing even a single hair on her head. She could feel her senses expanding as she made the adjustment from her human body to that of the Nibi, a form fashioned of flame and heat and raw, surging power. She rose, towering above the surrounding woods, and bathing the area in the pale blue light given off by her burning form. Her paws made contact with the earth, destroying the grass and trees and leaving nothing but blackened and scorched earth in their wake. Her two tails curled through the air, the tips glowing white and the air around them shimmering with heat. Her mouth opened wide, revealing white, sharply pointed columns of fire that served as her teeth and exposing the churning conflagration that burned deep within her body. Her target stood out to her senses like a bonfire, a distinctive feeling both like and unlike that she had gotten from Kurama that burned away any doubt she might have had regarding the identity of the ninja she had been tracking. Like Kurama, her target felt to her somehow clearer, firmer, more real than anything else she had ever experienced, either within her own form or that of the Nibi. At the same time, where Kurama felt heavy, as if just being near him placed a weight upon her shoulders, Konoha's missing Jinchuriki felt empty, even hollow, like she'd just stepped into a giant cave and found nothing but darkness stretching in every direction. She could feel the other ninja in the area, their chakra small sparks against her own blaze and that of the Jinchuriki. They were beginning to move, slowly converging on the large spark that stood next to her target. They were waiting for her to make the first move, however, and so she coiled her legs and leapt, crossing the remaining distance to the camp in a matter of moments and landing heavily, sending a swirl of fire sweeping through the area and coming to a rest with a paw on either side of the Jinchuriki she had come to capture, or kill. The ninja known as Sword had rolled to the side, reacting with impressive speed and avoiding the splash of fire that would have consumed her. The Jinchuriki responded to the attack with a surge of power, pushing back the heat that threatened him and standing firm, though with a fearful expression. No, that wasn't quite right, Yujito noted with concern. That expression was not one of fear. The Jinchuriki actually stepped forward, one hand slowly stretching out as if trying to touch her. He seemed to be moving calmly, almost languidly, a stark contrast to the frantic motions of Sword, who was even now being forced away from their position by the steady onslaught of nearly a dozen ninja. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly parted, and his expression was not fearful, but awed. The feeling he gave off was also changing, the hollow feeling fading to be replaced by the feeling that she was being watched, studied, like something was looking into her and through her and out of her all at once. Beautiful, the Jinchuriki whispered. Chapter 56, Bait and Switch, Part 2. Samui watched as the 100 squads moved to engage Sword. One team, each wielding a katana or tanto, closed into melee range and began a whirling dance of flashing steel as they seamlessly switched out with one another, attacking from an unexpected angle or turning one ninja's feint into a true attack from another. The second team stayed roughly 20 feet back, analyzing the progress of the fight and preparing to support the first team with a ranged bombardment of ninjutsu or kunai should they break off. The third team stayed further out still, taking up position near Samui and her own team as the reserve group. She wasn't sure if she believed the so-called independent known by the incredibly unimaginative pseudonym of Sword was actually Kushina Uzumaki or not, nor did she much care. She could respect the power needed for a ninja to eschew all of the hidden villages entirely and actually make it stick, certainly, but she couldn't help but feel a bit of contempt for them at the same time. No loyalty to a village, no loyalty to their fellow ninja, nothing to protect or fight for but themselves. The progress of the battle before her exemplified the power of a village and cooperation better than words ever could have. Sword looked frantic, her blade flashing about rapidly, keeping the hunter-nin at a distance as she managed to evade crippling blows by the narrowest of margins. She also seemed distracted by her companion's plight, if the way her gaze kept turning to where Yujito was cornering the Jinchuriki was any indication. Despite her best efforts, she was slowly being forced back as the hunter-nin did their job, the constant pressure of the whirling melee hurting her further and further from her companion. Sword was spilling out more and more killing intent as her frustration mounted, but it was wild and unfocused, certainly nothing that would faze any of the ninja arrayed against her. These were A-class ninja, every one of them, and they were damn good at what they did. Her eyes narrowed as something changed, though the only thing she noted was a subtle shift in Sword's stance. The ninja's left hand had loosened its grip, weakening her defense and allowing the Kumonin currently crossing blades with her to push forward, slowly overpowering her. One of the other ninjas saw an opening and slipped in, his tanto flashing in to score a deep gash on the back of Sword's leg, possibly even a crippling blow. Then Sword caught the blade barehanded before it could land as a shimmer formed along the edge of her nodachi. Samui's instincts screamed at her and she immediately leapt back, high and away. Her eyes slowly widened as she finally realized what had changed. Sword's killing intent, previously strong enough to clearly sense even if it was unfocused, was gone, vanished without a trace. Sword's left hand, the one holding the tanto, jerked to the side and then forward, snapping the tempered steel blade of the tanto and driving the broken fragment into her opponent's chest. At the same time her body flowed sideways and the air filled with the sound of screeching metal as her nodachi slid along the katana pressed against it. And then sliced through it, the nodachi's arc continuing as it cut through the ninja wielding the now broken katana with equal ease. 2 ninja dead, and still no killing intent. She knew these ninja, had gone on missions with them and fought side by side. This wasn't the first time she had seen friends die, nor would it be the last, but she forced the pain of their loss aside and focused on the battle, searching for any opening or weakness that she could use to keep the rest of her fellow ninja alive. The second hunter-nin squad began flashing through hand signs while the 2 surviving ninja on the melee team leapt back, realizing that they would be unable to maintain their assault any further. Sword let the arm holding the nodachi fully extend as she began turning her body. The faint shimmer along the edge of the blade was clearly visible now, a bright shining blue that sent chills down Samui's spine as she considered how much chakra it would take to produce that effect. Samui's feet touched down on the side of the tree and her mouth dropped open to scream a desperate warning. "Fall back," she shouted. Sword's body whirled in a full circle, the nodachi leading a faintly glowing trail of blue that surrounded her like a halo before slowly dissipating. And still no killing intent. Samui barely caught the ripple as it passed through the air, expanding from Sword in all directions and passing through the Kumonin on the ground moments later. She felt the tree beneath her shudder as the ripple struck it, and the small but inevitable shift in gravity as it began tilting sideways. The Kumonin who had been in the path of the ripple just collapsed, their bodies falling to the ground in pieces as puddles of blood began to rapidly form beneath the Sword was already bringing up her blade in a 2-handed grip, her entire body giving the impression of absolute focus that was at odds with her previously frantic and desperate demeanor. Her head turned slowly from side to side before coming to rest on the nearest living Kumonin, the sole survivor of the melee team who had landed amongst the branches of a tree in a crouch. Samui swallowed thickly. Yujito's warning seemed especially apt now, if that was what Sword was really capable of. And still no killing intent. If she was honest with herself, that was unnerving her as every bit as much as facing off against the overwhelming power of her teacher did. Scene break. Beautiful, the Jinchuriki whispered. Yujito actually stopped moving for a moment, completely taken aback by the word and the tone the Jinchuriki had used. She couldn't even imagine what he meant by that, or why he would be saying it now of all times. She certainly didn't consider the burning mass of flames that comprised her current form beautiful, not by any stretch. She would have been tempted to dismiss it as a ploy if it weren't for how sincere he seemed. He didn't even seem to notice that he was completely surrounded by flames that were even now singing the edges of his clothing, or that the grass under his feet was drying up and withering just being near her paws. She shoved the distraction aside, flaring the chakras surrounding the Jinchuriki higher and raising the temperature even further. He finally seemed to realize the situation he was in, jerking back with a startled look as his strangely shifting chakra faltered. His odd trance broken, he staggered back and turned, trying to escape from her clutches. A fiery paw slammed into his path, setting the ground ablaze and sending a wave of heat slamming into him. The Jinchuriki staggered back, one hand raised to ward off the flames while he turned his body away. His chakra flared again, pushing against hers and sending the oddest rippling sensation through her. Yujito couldn't feel any intent behind the ripple, no direction or purposeful movements, not even a trace of the Jinchuriki's chakra contained within it, but it gave her pause all the same. Even it seemed to be taken aback, the flow of its chakra faltering for a moment before stabilizing. She clamped down tighter on its chakra, making sure she remained firmly in control. The Jinchuriki was trying to flee again, his legs pumping with impressive speed and power as he raced away from her paws. She slammed her other paw down in his path and pushed out her chakra to surround him completely, cutting off any potential escape. The Jinchuriki's skin was slowly reddening from the continued close exposure to the tailed beast's form, the sweat vaporizing from his skin before it had even properly left his pores. She raised the heat again before lowering it to a slightly more tolerable level just to make her point. "Surrender before I turn you to ash," she growled. She hated the way her voice was distorted in this form, but it served its purpose. The Jinchuriki flared his chakra again, and again she felt that odd rippling sensation. It didn't react this time, though, so she was satisfied that her tighter control was sufficient to counter whatever it was the Jinchuriki was doing, consciously or not. She pushed the heat higher, high enough to drive him to his knees as she lowered her head and allowed her jaws to open wide, exposing the white-hot furnace that lay within the heart of the tailed beast's form. Last chance, she told him, leaving the heat where it was. She knew that this temperature would be enough to start causing superficial burns even without direct contact, and continued exposure would eventually kill him just as surely as a kunai to the heart. "Fine," the Jinchuriki gasped out, his voice rasping. "Fine, I surrender." Yujito immediately lowered the temperature, then broke off a portion of her chakra to shape into a sphere that surrounded her prisoner. The sphere shimmered, shifting between pale blue and white across the surface. The Jinchuriki hunched over, staring at the edge of his shirt that had touched the sphere and instantly been reduced to ashes. She would have preferred to immediately set out for Kumo with her prisoner in tow, but the spike in Sword's chakra along with the sudden disappearance of several of the sparks that signified the chakra of her fellow Kumonin was worrying her. "You won't get another chance, so don't even think about trying to break free," she warned the Jinchuriki. The sphere itself would do some serious damage should he try it, though she wouldn't be surprised if he had some method of escaping at his disposal. He was unlikely to allow her to get this close again without making her work for it, and she wasn't going to count on getting that lucky again. If he so much as twitched in a way she didn't like, she would reduce him to ash and subdue the release-tailed beast directly while Kurabi's students prepared the temporary sealing array. She started to turn her attention to Sword when she felt 3 more ninja approaching, 2 with nearly as much chakra as Sword and a third that blazed to her senses, telling her that another Jinchuriki was closing in fast. Very fast. Scene break. "You doing alright, Un?" Deidara shouted over the rushing wind, his voice tinged with worry even as his hands were busy shaping a large mass of clay. "I'm fine," Fu insisted, forcibly ignoring the slowly building haze in her mind. Something had changed in the last few days, though she had no idea what it was exactly. This sort of thing had never happened before, not even remotely, and she was growing increasingly concerned as it got worse. She felt a little different after Jiraiya had tweaked her seal, certainly. She had a hard time not pulling too much of the Biju's Yuki after that, which had messed with her chakra control for a while. Like all of the other guardians, she had made the adjustment well enough in time, with Konan overseeing her efforts in that regard and Deidara helping her out the whole way. This was something else, though. She'd never used so much of the Biju's Yuki before, nor had she ever used it for such a long period of time at a stretch. She could barely remember the last day of their flight to the Land of Lightning, and she definitely didn't remember trying to seduce Deidara right in front of Konan like that. She was grateful that Konan had those tags at hand. Even if she felt absolutely horrible when she eventually woke up, she was at least capable of thinking clearly and controlling her own actions. Now, however, she'd only been actively using Yuki for a few minutes and she could already feel the euphoria growing. She already decided that she was going to ask Jiraiya to tighten up the seal again when they got back. Whatever extra power she had at her disposal wasn't worth the impairment that came with it. "If you say so, Deidara said, his tone making it clear that he didn't fully believe her. "We're coming in for the first pass," Fu said, bringing their attention back to their mission. "Keep an eye open for the Jinchuriki." They could already make out the towering form of a Biju that had drawn their attention in the first place, the Nibi judging by the tails. That meant Yujito Ni was involved, but also meant that she was facing something that justified using that much of her Biju's Yuki. Odds were very good that meant she was dealing with the Kyubi. The manifested form of the Biju turned to face them, its form swelling to nearly twice its original size and its twin tails arcing high into the air threateningly. Fu smirked, more than willing to take up that challenge. "Hang on, Deku-in. Looks like Kitty wants to play." "Play?" Deidara echoed, glancing ahead before his face rapidly paled. "Wait, don't dash." Fu's wings flared wide as delighted laughter poured from her lips. They slowed for a moment, almost hovering in front of the Nibi's form tauntingly. The twin tails lashed forward, trailing plumes of fire in their wake even as Fu's wings blurred and they shot sideways, then forward, then in several other directions as she danced around the flailing limbs with ease. After a few seconds she turned and rapidly opened the distance between Yujito and herself, still giggling in delight. "HRK," Fu heard, and she glanced down to see Deidara looking slightly green as he swallowed thickly. "You alright, Deku-in?" she asked in concern. "Fine," he answered after a moment. He breathed deeply and shook himself before he resumed shaping the clay, forming it into a vaguely humanoid form. "I spotted our target. Ni has him trapped in a sphere of fire, though who knows how long that will last. Right now, though, he's stationary." "What do you want me to do?" Fu asked. "Take us in for another pass," he said, grinning widely as he began pumping chakra into his creation. "Then it'll be time to run like hell." Scene break. Yujito hissed in frustration as the pair of ninjas sped away. They hadn't made any attempt to attack yet, but the sheer maneuverability they showed in the air was worrying. She doubted she could hit them even with perfect aim given just how quickly they could change directions, barely losing any speed as they did so. She would have to alter her tactics accordingly. "Hey!" she heard the captured Jinchuriki shout, his voice carrying clearly to her. "Those are members of Akatsuki." "That's Fu, Jinchuriki of the Seven Tails." Yujito didn't bother to respond, though she filed the name Akatsuki away for later. She'd heard rumors of the new group of ninja making a splash in the elemental nations recently, but she hadn't realized they had gotten their hands on a Jinchuriki, especially that one. Kumo was still scrambling to explain just what had happened with the Taki incident, especially since the IWA refugees. They had taken and unanimously stated that IWA had indeed lost their containers over a decade ago, and the fate of Taki's missing Jinchuriki had been a major concern. Perhaps they had an answer at last. "They'll try to capture you too," the Jinchuriki continued shouting. "And they'll just kill you to extract your tail, beast." The third ninja was still hanging back, hovering a considerable distance away and observing the progress of the battle. The flying Jinchuriki and her companion were changing direction to come in for another pass, all the while charging what felt like a large attack. And 2 more Kumonin had died facing off against Sword. This must have been the trap the Jinchuriki was hoping to lure them into. Was the Jinchuriki involved with Akatsuki, or was that name just a smokescreen? "If you just let me out, I could dash." "Silence," Yujito snapped. "You will remain where you are, or you will die. Your friends aren't going to help you now." She focused her attention on the pair of flyers as they picked up speed. "Friends," the Jinchuriki yelped.
No!
"They aren't here to help. They're here to capture or kill both of us." Yujito's tails weaved a pattern in the air, leading trails of glowing fire that formed a net in the sky. The flyers began gaining altitude in response, though their direction didn't change. Yujito waited, her tails continuing their work as the flyers drew closer and closer. When she judged they were close enough, she leapt up, passing through the burning net and dragging it with her. Her form blurred for a moment, the air around her growing hazy as her form shifted hues to nearly incandescent white, then her tails flicked forward, casting the net far and wide as it shifted into an enormous wall of fire that closed in on the flying Jinchuriki from all sides. As soon as she tossed the fiery net, she began preparing another attack aimed at where she suspected the flyers would try to escape. The net was wide enough and large enough that the Jinchuriki would probably simply reverse direction to evade it, and so doing, she would run right into the second attack Yujito would launch from behind the concealment of her first attack. Even as she released a large, coiling column of fire towards where she could feel the Jinchuriki moving, a large concentration of chakra detached from the pair of flyers and began dropping straight towards the ground. She glanced at it to determine what sort of attack it was, only to find a strange, vaguely humanoid statue that was rapidly growing in size even as its disproportionately large arms spread until they were held out horizontally from its sides. Yujito grinned to herself as her second attack succeeded. After a fashion, the flyers had caught sight of the second column of fire and made the choice to brave the less concentrated wall rather than the thick column of flames. She could hear dual screams of pain as her opponents gained first-hand knowledge of just how incredibly dangerous her flames actually were, though she was disappointed to find that they survived it nonetheless. They turned and immediately began fleeing in a more or less straight line, only varying their direction slightly to shake off further attacks. The third flyer began retreating as well, moving at an angle that would intercept her allies. The statue hit the ground next to her captive and just settled in place for a moment. Then she felt 2 surges of chakra in rapid succession, one small and one large, before a shock wave slammed into her. Scene break.
Fuck!
Fu yelled, clenching her teeth as she pushed through the pain. Fu had been surprised at how quickly Kumo's Jinchuriki had adapted her tactics for aerial combat, but had ultimately dismissed the net that she had fucking painted onto thin air using fire as a defensive measure designed to ward them off rather than some kind of attack. She'd been surprised when a cat-like being had jumped into its own net, and even more surprised when she managed to throw the entire thing at her, the flames spreading wide enough to cover a significant portion of the sky yet still thick enough to present an effective barrier. Even that she could have dealt with, since they had gotten close enough for Deidara to drop his little present. When she reversed direction, though, she completely missed the fucking 50-meter wide river of fire that the Jinchuriki had managed to spew out until it had been almost on top of them. She'd made the split-second decision to not get hit by that, instead taking her chances with the much thinner wall of flames. She'd wrapped herself and Deidara in a cocoon formed from her wings, trusting that the Bija's Yuki would take the brunt of any damage. It probably had, but that didn't mean that they both hadn't ended up covered with a network of crisscrossing burns that had been seared into their skin. It had gone through their clothing in an instant, hitting their flesh and clinging to them like leeches, burning all the while. She had to draw on her Biju's power again before she managed to get the stuff off of them, and this time could actually see it eating its way through the Yuki-like acid before she flung it away. They'd already lost precious seconds dealing with that fucking Kumo Jinchuriki's fire, and they still needed to get at least a mile away before Deidara set off his bomb. They couldn't wait too long, though, because every second they delayed was more time for their target to defend himself or get away or somehow disable the technique. So she ignored the pain, ignored the ugly bands of blackened flesh that traced up and down her arms and back, and flew. She was rapidly catching up to Conan, the blue-haired woman flapping her paper wings steadily as she headed away from the source of the coming blast while her hands were busy rapidly forming a large half-dome out of yet more paper. They'd practiced this scenario relentlessly ever since Leader Sama had decided they were better off killing the Kyuubi than trying to capture him, and they had eventually determined their best option for riding out the massive explosion that was sure to accompany the Biju's banishment. Conan would create a barrier using a combination of hardened paper and Fuinjutsu seals to deflect and absorb the blast when it reached them, while Fu continued to pull all three of them along with the shield directly away from the blast. That had been more than enough for Deidara's largest bombs, and should be enough for the Kyuubi. They had no way to know for sure, of course, and even Deidara admitted that an explosion that could devastate the land for miles and miles was well beyond the largest he could ever manage. They performed several test runs out in the middle of the frozen northern seas and decided that they could completely avoid the largest blast Deidara could produce if they could reach a quarter of a mile away. They could stay even closer if they didn't mind getting knocked around a bit. They also noticed that the distance they needed to stay back increased very little compared to the amount of power he poured into his art. They had settled on 1 mile as the absolute minimum distance needed to ride out the blast the Kyuubi's banishment would produce, and would strive to double that if at all possible. Unfortunately, it didn't look like they had that luxury.
Do it!
Conan snapped as soon as they reached her, and she began repositioning the dome to shield them from the blast. Several tethers reached out from the dome and wrapped around Fu, who hissed as they tightened around her burns but made no other protest, instead pouring on even more speed as she tried to get them as much distance as possible. Deidara grunted, ignoring his own burns as he raised one hand. "Katsu," he barked, grinning through the pain. A low rumble filled the air behind them, and they all tensed, bracing themselves against the hollow interior of the paper dome, waiting for the blast of air that accompanied Deidara's explosions to hit them. And waited. And waited. Fu paused in her flight, slowing and turning to look back towards the source of the distant explosion. They caught the final moments of the fiery dome as it dissipated, leaving a cloud of smoke and a large crater in its wake. "That wasn't a big boom," Fu pointed out through clenched teeth. Deidara nodded. "Yeah, that was just my C3, Shit," Fu groaned. "That means we've got to go back again." Deidara quickly pulled out some medical supplies and began slathering salve over both of their burns. Fu nodded gratefully, though in truth it made little difference to the pain she was feeling from what that fucking Kumonin had done to her. She didn't even want to think what would have happened if she'd taken the other attack full on. "Can you still fight?" Conan asked as she let the shield she had created dissolve back into its paper components. "Yeah," Fu growled. "I'm good." "Yeah, Deidara echoed. "Then finish patching yourselves up quickly. We've already lost our best shot, and we still need to finish this before we attract any more attention." Scene break. Yujito pulled out of her tumble just in time to get her feet under herself and land in a crouch. Her wildly fluctuating chakras slowly calmed, restoring her form to its normal pristine appearance as she shook herself. Whatever that attack was, it managed to reach her real body through the thick shell of chakra that surrounded her, shaking her around and disorienting her for several seconds. She couldn't feel any lasting damage, but she was wary of getting any closer to a blast of that magnitude. She turned back to where that strange statue had landed, noting the large crater with thick smoke still pouring out of it. She'd lost track of her captive along with everything else when the blast hit her, and she couldn't find any trace of his chakra. No, wait. He was there, next to Sword and the few remaining Kumonin. His signature was even stranger now, flickering in and out of her senses like a candle puttering out in the face of a fierce wind. Was that due to the damage he had taken, or something else? Even as she began moving in that direction, his signature stabilized, slowly gaining strength and returning to the hollow cave-like feeling she had first sensed. She kept part of her attention on the supposed Akatsuki ninja, who were hovering in the air nearly 2 miles away. They were stationary for the moment, no doubt trying to figure out if their attack had succeeded and licking their wounds. She didn't expect that to last very long, however. As she approached the other ninja on the ground, she could make out Sword and the Jinchuriki standing next to each other, the younger ninja talking rapidly and gesturing wildly while Sword stood motionlessly, her blade held in front of her with 2 hands. The Kumonin were spread out around the clearing, some on the ground and some up in the trees. They were watching the situation closely, their hands and arms flickering as they signaled each other and tried to make a plan to counter their enemy. Abruptly Sword spun in Yujito's direction, raising her blade and bringing it down in a powerful 2-handed swipe. She didn't understand what the ninja was trying to do until she sensed the razor-sharp line of chakra barreling straight towards her. Yujito leapt to the side, avoiding the hit for the most part but still taking a glancing blow along her flank and through one of her tails. Her eyes widened as the line of chakras sliced through her form with ease, barely slowing as it passed. Her form restored itself in the wake of the attack with barely a swirl of chakra, but she knew if her real body had been in the way of that it would have been a different story. The Jinchuriki had one hand on Sword's arm now, still talking rapidly. Yujito was close enough to make out some of what they were saying now. Aren't the real threat here. Akatsuki is, and they'll, if they can. Part of Yujito bristled at the implied dismissal, but she could understand where the boy was coming from. Kumo might end up extracting the tailed beast from the boy and killing him, but there was at least a chance they would try to subvert him first. That bomb had made it clear to Yujito that the new arrivals were not here to help out the Jinchuriki, and capturing certainly wasn't their goal. Yujito approached slowly, coming to a stop some distance away and making no overt threatening gestures, though she certainly didn't release her tailed beast form either. Sword seemed content with that, though the blade was still pointed in her direction. Please, Ka-san, for me? Yujito's eyes widened as that bit of information filtered into her ears. Naruto Yamanaka was Kushina Uzumaki's son? Kushina Uzumaki, who had apparently gone missing shortly after her own son was born and spent over a decade parading around as an independent contractor? Just what the hell was going on in Konoha? That could have major implications for their own approach to the situation, and if things were as shady in Konoha as that information suggested, subverting the Jinchuriki might not be out of the question. Sword, who had just killed 7 Kumonin, on the other hand. Sword lowered the Nodachi slightly, looking over at her son. They aren't here to help you, Naruto-kun, she said, her voice distorted by the mask she was wearing. They only care about what you have sealed inside of you. There are things they don't know, Ka-san, and Akatsuki is a major part of that. If we get a chance to talk, things will change. If you both surrender, Yujito called out, I give you my word that you will not be harmed. Just me, the Jinchuriki shot back immediately. Sword will leave under her own power. Absolutely not. Sword spat, the Nodachi raising back to its previous position. Further conversation was cut off when Akatsuki returned, hovering over their position several hundred feet in the air. Surrender the Kyuubi to us, and the rest of you may go free, a woman's voice called out. We have no quarrel with you. Sword stepped closer to the Jinchuriki, her blade shifting between Yujito and the ninja in the sky. You are in Kumo territory, Yujito replied, her tails coiling behind her and her form shimmering with heat. Leave now or face the consequences. Silence reigned for several seconds, each group tense and wary as they studied the others. Yujito could see the other Kumonin, especially Kurabi's team, were furious with the situation and were signaling their desire to kill both of the other teams. Sword and her son were standing back to back, the former scanning constantly for any sign of attack and the latter talking lowly, too low for Yujito to hear. The ninja in the sky were waiting patiently, their stance confident as they looked down on the gathered ninja. Then one of the ninja in the sky began charging an attack, one that felt almost identical to the technique that had caused that explosion earlier. Last chance, Yujito told them, crouching low and bringing up her tails to point at the Akatsuki members. The Kumonin around her shifted their stances to focus more on Akatsuki as the primary threat. The group in the air made no reply, and the attack continued to charge. "You were warned," Yujito shouted, more for the benefit of her own team than her targets. Her tails twisted and a thick stream of fire shot into the air, narrowly missing the Akatsuki ninja as the one with the green wings pulled the others out of the way. The agile flyer was forced to continue dodging as lightning techniques shot towards her, the much smaller but faster techniques just as effective at threatening her. Yujito growled in frustration when she felt Sword and the Jinchuriki start running as they took advantage of the battle to try and escape. "Samui! Handle this," she called out before bounding after the fleeing ninja. She felt one of the flyers, the one who had hung back earlier, break off and follow her as well. She caught up with Sword and the Jinchuriki less than a minute later and launched a large stream of fire to cut off their escape route. Sword immediately dropped her son, who she had been physically carrying as she fled, and sent another of those razor-sharp lines of chakra her way. She dodged enough to keep her real body safe and responded with a thick stream of fire that washed over the Nodachi-wielding ninja. She kept it up for several seconds, growing concerned when the ninja's chakra did not falter under the onslaught at all. Yujito dropped the attack to find a barrier made of interlocking chains surrounding Kushina and her son. Sword stepped out of the barrier, leading the chains in place to protect the Jinchuriki as she moved out to engage her opponents directly. "Perhaps we can help one another after all," a voice said from above Yujito, and she turned to find a blue-haired woman wearing a red and black cloak hovering above her, her pure white wings flapping lazily in the air. "We both seek the destruction of the Kyubi Jinchuriki, it seems." Yujito leapt aside as another of Sword's attack cut through her form, and the ninja in the air dodged one that had been sent her way. "I will deal with those chains, so you may concentrate on turning Sword to ash," the woman announced. "Once she is dealt with, the Jinchuriki shall be easy prey." "You are hardly my ally," Yujito pointed out suspiciously, keeping a wary eye on both Sword and the Akatsuki ninja. "Of course not," the woman scoffed. "But we have the same goal for now, and that is enough." The woman didn't bother saying anything else, instead sending out a stream of white. Was that paper? Yes, she was sending out a stream of paper towards Sword. The thin sheets plastered themselves across the chains that were sent out to intercept them, wrapping around the chakra constructs before beginning to glow. The chains flailed around for a moment, perhaps trying to shake the paper off, before they dissolved to be replaced by new chains. Yujito's eyes narrowed as she considered the timing. It looked like the paper would either directly break the chains or force Kushina to release them for some reason. Either way, it would be enough of an opening for her fire to get through. Sword seemed to realize that as well, as she began flinging out those arcs of chakra that could slice through her form rapidly while she began dodging about, pulling their attention away from her son. Every slip of paper that even approached the barrier around him was intercepted or destroyed without fail. The Jinchuriki, still stuck within the barrier and now well away from the fight, began flexing and flaring his chakra as he finally prepared to take part in the battle himself. The air around Yujito hissed as she pulled deeply on her tailed beast's chakra, her form turning to nearly an incandescent white as she prepared to unleash another attack. She didn't trust the other ninja at all, but she wasn't going to miss a chance to take care of one of her enemies either. She'd just have to be prepared to break off her attack at the first sign of the woman acting against her in any way, So far she had been focused on sword, but Yujito wasn't foolish enough to believe that the other woman would pass up a chance to strike at her as well. The Jinchuriki was pushing against the barrier around him, his face contorting into an angry growl as his efforts to escape were blocked. A high-pitched screech filled the air, though Yujito couldn't place the source of it. She could feel the Jinchuriki's chakra shifting again, that hollow quality fading and the feeling of being watched coming back stronger than ever. A flurry of paper surrounded Kushina, latching onto every chain she manifested and threatening to reach the woman herself, and Yujito acted. The Jinchuriki somehow stepped through the barrier just as Yujito unleashed the stream of white-hot fire that slammed into the whirling mass of paper and chakra chains surrounding sword. He let out a wordless scream of rage and thrust out his hands, and before she could break off her attack to deal with the new threat, the world flashed white. Yujito felt something slam into her, and for the first time she could ever remember her tailed beast form itself felt pain. It felt like every bit of chakra the form contained had been turned into a nerve ending then set on fire. Her stream of fire cut off abruptly as she collapsed, curling into a ball. The tailed beast form she had manifested temporarily lost cohesion, breaking apart in a wash of fire and chakra that flowed across the ground around her. She heard the ear-splitting crack a moment later, sounding for all the world like the entire mountain had just split in half. The source of the pain vanished just as quickly as it had come, though the echoes of it lingered throughout her body. She felt the tailed beast's chakra surrounding her again in a soothing embrace and focused on that as she forced her body to respond. She scrambled to her feet and quickly took stock of the situation. The Jinchuriki was nowhere to be seen, nor could she feel his chakra anywhere. The same was true of sword. The only sign of her last stand was the uneven scorch marks on the ground and the burning bits of paper floating in the breeze. The Akatsuki ninja was. Yujito heard the flutter of paper around her and flared her chakra to destroy them, but it was already too late. She could feel the tailed beast's chakra retreating back into her body, slipping through her gasp and leaving her panting on the ground. More papers slapped onto her exposed skin, sending jolts of pain through her before she collapsed, unable to control her limbs. "My apologies, little one," the woman said, her tone distracted. "We were going to leave you for later, but this changes things. To see the Hiraishin now." Yujito wanted to fight back, wanted to ask what the woman was talking about, but she felt her consciousness slipping away before she could. Chapter 57, Bait and Switch, Part 3. Conan stared down at Yujito's paper-covered form, absent-mindedly adding another layer of seals to the ones already present. If the Kyuubi had not lashed out with that odd lightning-based attack, she doubted she would have been able to take down the Nibi's container without taking some injuries herself. Kumo's younger Jinchuriki had shown a stunning mastery of her beast form, far more than what any of the Guardians were capable of. This would need to be taken into account for when they eventually confronted Kurabi. Her eyes strayed to the scorched ground where Sword had made her last stand, and where she had seen the Kyuubi use the Hiraishin to jump in and rescue her before jumping out once again in another flash of yellow. The Hiraishin was a legendary technique for good reason, and all of the villages had breathed a collective sigh of relief when the fourth Hokage, its only user, had passed away. For it to reappear now, and in the hands of one of the Bijin no less, did not bode well for anyone. Nagato needed to know about this as soon as possible, and they would need to step up their plans accordingly. She walked over and picked up the discarded, partially melted blade that had once been an odachi. The hilt and guard were still intact, but a good 2 feet of the blade was reduced to so much melted scrap, and what remained of it was warped and useless. While it had probably been a very well-made sword, the metal was plain steel and there were no seals inscribed on it anywhere that she could see. After seeing the technique Sword had used the Nodachi for, she had half expected to find that it was fashioned out of chakra metal like the 7 swords of the mist, but that wasn't the case. It was just a sword. Actually, it wasn't even that anymore. Tossing the useless ruin of the blade aside, Conan started back to her prisoner when she felt a tightly controlled burst of chakra from behind her and to the left. She whirled, reflexively tossing a set of paper shuriken in the direction as she readied herself to counter whatever attack this was. She caught sight of a black cloak swirling through the air as the figure dove under her attack, then rolled smoothly and sprang forward, a black gloved fist leading the way. A whip of paper wrapped around the hand, pulling her attacker off balance while two more streams flowed forward to capture the ninja. Conan's eyes continued to pick out details as she counterattacked, noting the ANBU style mask that was missing any of the traditional animal markings, or any markings at all, except for the eye slits that were outlined in blue. There was another surge of chakra and the ninja burst through her paper, breaking her constructs and scattering them into the wind as they closed into melee range once more. Conan spun away from another punch, forming a blade of razor-sharp paper and slicing at the ninja's arm. The extra reach her blade gave her saved her from another attack, as the ninja's follow-up punch halted with less than an inch to spare as they avoided a cut that would have sliced through the ninja's neck. Then the fingers on the fist that had stopped just shy of making contact flicked out, brushing against her chest, and Conan felt like Nagato had just struck her with a Shinra Tensei. She was thrown backwards, bouncing twice before she dissolved into a mass of paper butterflies that rapidly dispersed, leaving her abandoned prisoner and several splotches of blood behind. Scene break. Tsunade bit back a growl of frustration as the blue-haired Akatsuki member made her escape. She could tell that her blow, while damaging, hadn't done enough to put the woman down for good. She was clearly used to combat and had been reinforcing her entire body with chakra reflexively throughout the battle. She also had an odd feeling that she should know that woman, even if she was certain she had never met her before, but, whoever it was, they were not to be taken lightly if they could destroy Kushina's blade and capture the woman herself. Part of her wanted to track the ninja down and take care of things once and for all, but she had to take care of Kushina first. She darted over to the bound figure and performed a quick inspection. Kushina was covered head to toe in paper, every one of them a seal. Unraveling that mess safely would not be a trivial task. There was no sign of any blood and other serious injuries, however, and she doubted the ninja would have tried to take her prisoner if she was dying. Deciding that anything else would have to wait, she picked up the bound form and headed south. She had already confirmed that the other battle taking place nearby was between two other Akatsuki members and a group of Kumo ninja and wanted no part of it. Once she had made it to a safe place, she would get Kushina back on her feet and they could finish tracking down Naruto together. Everything else was a secondary concern. Fu cursed as she banked sharply and rose higher, avoiding another blast of lightning. The Kumonin were getting a lot better about their aim, and Deidara was starting to slow down as his wounds and chakra expenditure caught up with him. "This isn't working, hun," he panted out between pulling in lungfuls of air. "No shit." Fu snapped as lightning shot past her close enough to singe her hair. The tricky bastards were changing up their timing and getting trickier about where they placed their attacks, trying to catch her off guard or hurt her into the path of another attack. Without Deidara dropping bombs to harass them, they had all the time they needed to do so. She was having trouble keeping her movements gentle enough to avoid aggravating their injuries as it was, and she certainly couldn't get close enough herself to attack them. "We should just retreat, Deidara continued, shooting her a sour look for her comment. "Conan should have finished things up by now, Before Fu could reply, a swarm of red and white butterflies entered the battlefield, swirling around the Kumo ninja and interrupting their jutsu. Another butterfly placed itself in Fu's path and her hand flashed out to grab it as she passed. It had just one word written on it in a hasty scrawl not at all like Conan's normally graceful and elegant handwriting. "Retreat." Fu's wings flared as she shot higher, then she shot north as she began marking her way back to their prearranged meeting place. She would be glad to put this fucked up mission behind them. Scene break. It was nearly 3 hours and 4 avoided Kumo patrols later before Tsunade was satisfied that she was far enough away from the site of the battle and that she had not been followed or detected. The first hint of dawn was just beginning to show in the east when she finally stopped and placed Kushina in the shade of a small rock outcropping and set about removing the seals that kept her bound. They were a mix of paralysis tags and chakra suppression seals, all focused on keeping the prisoner helpless and thus nothing that would prevent her from removing them. She carefully peeled them away one by one, making sure that there weren't any other surprises lurking underneath the first layer. It was a slow, nerve-wracking process that did little to improve her already foul mood. Her first hint that something was wrong was the lock of long blonde hair that was exposed when she pulled away one of the seals. She focused on the seals wrapped around her companion's head after that and soon found herself staring down at the lightly tanned face of someone she didn't know. She continued to remove the rest of the seals, hoping to find some sort of identifying marks. She ended up getting a very thorough inspection, as the woman was completely nude under the seals, not even a hetaie to indicate which village she served. She had a wiry build, a small collection of scars that looked like they had come from an assortment of blades, and a tattoo on her right shoulder blade that Tsunade didn't recognize. Tsunade draped her cloak over the woman, then sat back on her heels to think. She had clearly seen the Akatsuki member with the remains of Kushina's sword, and had assumed that the bound figure nearby must have been Kushina. Obviously she was wrong on that front, but that left the question of just what had happened to Kushina. The woman never went anywhere without her sword, and even with it destroyed she wasn't likely to simply abandon it. Tsunade considered the possible scenarios that would explain the situation she had found, but was unable to narrow down the possibilities significantly. There were too many unknowns, too much time where she wasn't present to observe events. There was also the question of the woman she had inadvertently rescued. Given that Akatsuki was interested in her, chances were very good she was related to the tailed beasts in some fashion. Add that they were in Kumo, and that a male ninja named Kurabi was widely known as the container for the eight-tailed beast, and this woman could quite possibly be the container for the two-tailed one. Her intervention in that case was a good thing, and would likely earn herself and Kushina a lot of favors with the village in addition to preventing Akatsuki from gaining even more power. She still needed to find out just what had happened to Kushina, however, and the only person who could tell her that right now was sitting beside her. Now all she had to do was figure out how to wake her up and talk to her without getting attacked herself. She had no desire to deal with a panicked and violent Jinchuriki, after all. Scene break. Kushu leaned back on the couch, his gaze drifting around the office that made up Yagura's mindscape. The former Mizukichi himself was once more asleep in his chair, his slumber enforced by Kunori. Neither of the Bijou wanted the ninja aware for this portion of their conversation. After all, where do we stand on taking down Akatsuki? Kushu asked after a moment. Things are beginning to come together, Kunori replied from her position perched on top of the desk. We do not yet possess sufficient force to take them on directly, but the balance is shifting in our favor. Shichu's Jinchuriki has displayed no signs that she understands her true abilities yet, and it is unlikely that she ever will at this point. The threat she represents is minimal. Sinan's container shows much more command over her powers, but without Akai's presence their threat is a mere fraction of what it could be. The leader's powers are a cause for concern, but he is merely human and can be worn down, given time. The situation with Orochimaru, Akai, and Hoshigaki will be the tipping point, I believe. The so-called tailless beast proved himself to be difficult to deal with in his match against Ryudo, but his ability to absorb our Yuki is neither infallible or limitless. Even so, it would be best if he were to fall before returning to Akatsuki. Kushu nodded thoughtfully, remembering what Ryudo had shown him of the battle with Kisame Hoshigaki. That sword of his was well suited to facing Bijou, but still left the ninja vulnerable to more physical attacks. Ryudo was rather looking forward to a rematch between them, now that he knew what he would be facing. What of Ensu? Kunori grimaced briefly. I have not been able to positively identify Ensu's container, or even his presence within aim. I am hesitant to act openly before the container can be identified and neutralized. No shit, Kushu muttered as he let out a slow breath. You think the ninja will have any better luck? If enough pressure is brought to bear, Akatsuki will be forced to utilize Ensu's container. Once he has been identified, then we can act to remove him. Until that time, we focus our efforts on isolating Akatsuki as a whole and exploiting openings as they appear. The other members are powerful for humans, but as long as they can be fought in isolation, they are easily dealt with. The true threat remains their ability to seal us away, a problem that I have yet to satisfactorily resolve. Kushu glanced upwards, taking in the massive sealing array that hung above them. The seal contained thousands of individual elements, sections spreading in every direction as they looped about themselves in elegant strands and tightly woven chains. The array had shifted to become fully three-dimensional since he last saw it, making him wonder how its current form would ever be successfully written in the real world, even if it actually fulfilled its purpose. "What of your own efforts?" Kunori asked, a hint of irritation in her tone. Kushu smirked at her for a moment before he answered. Kunori always became short-tempered when wrestling with a problem of this magnitude. "Ino should be within Kumogakure by now, or will be shortly," Kushu replied. "I'll be moving to the cave we prepared to wait for her arrival with either Saika or Susan's container starting tomorrow," Kushu commented idly. His gaze lingered on the tapestry that covered the wall opposite his position, scanning it quickly as it flashed through the available intelligence they had on Kumo's Jinchuriki. "You intend to confront Susan's container within a mountain?" Kunori asked, one delicate eyebrow rising in amusement. "That seems rather stupid, even for you." Kushu shot a glare towards Kunori and let out a half-hearted snarl of annoyance. "The sealing array will prevent the Jinchuriki from doing anything." His sister smirked at him, but let the matter slide. "What of the Mizukage and Itachi?" "Itachi is already leading the ninja investigating him towards Akatsuki. If he gets the timing right, they should report back to the village about his clear ties to the criminal organization a day or two after Ino finishes her part of the plan. Once Kumo starts moving, Mei will do her part as well. She won't budge an inch until that happens, though. That will suffice." "What about you?" Kushu asked pointedly. "Have you actually managed to track down the snake?" "I have not. He has outright abandoned several of the outposts I was aware of, and is only making contact with his village through proxies. Hashigaki has been dispatched to track him down, however, and my host assures me that the former swordsman will succeed given time. I have turned my attention to other endeavors while I await results there. It would be nice to have Akai around when the time comes," Kushu mused. "It would, but there is still time. The ninja villages can be remarkably slow about an official war." "True," Kushu replied, smirking. "What else have you?" He cut himself off and shot to his feet as two signatures appeared nearby in the real world. He shot a look at Kunori, who blinked for a moment before nodding. "Ino has returned early, it appears, and with an unexpected companion," Kunori commented dryly. "I suspect they will require your assistance." Kushu pulled himself out of the mindscape, experiencing a moment of disorientation before he adjusted to his container's senses once again. The smell of blood and burned flesh assaulted his nostrils, and his head snapped to the side to find Ino kneeling on the ground, cradling a gravely wounded Kushina Uzumaki. "Help her!" Ino croaked out, turning a pleading expression in his direction. Kushu grimaced slightly at the sight. It was only his container's face, but it was just wrong to see that kind of look on it. He shifted his attention to Kushina, sending streams of Yuki into her body as he assessed the damage. The burns were extensive, covering most of her front and sides. Her hands were particularly bad, but it was the damage to her throat and lungs which was killing her. He started his work there, allowing his training and instincts to take over as he turned toward Ino. Ino wasn't nearly as wounded, but both of her hands had picked up nasty burns that seemed to be centered on her palms. He'd deal with that after he was done with Kushina. "What happened?" he asked. Ino opened her mouth then paused, struggling to find something to say. Eventually she shook off her stupor and frowned. "Kushina showed up out of nowhere and wouldn't leave," she began. "When the Kumo ninja did finally show up to capture me, led by Saika's Jinchuriki, she tried to save me and give me time to run away. Then Akatsuki showed up and tried to kill me and then... Kushu listened attentively as Ino continued to explain what had happened up until she fled with Kushina, leaving Saika's container behind. Can you go back? He asked quickly. The plan to infiltrate Kumo is shot at this point, but you could at least bring back the Jinchuriki. With Kanori and I both here we'll be able to subdue her quickly enough. Ino's head dropped. No, she admitted quietly. The closest Horatian seal is back near the border of Kumo. They'll be long gone by the time I could get back. Even if I could get in and out before they could react, which I doubt, I would need to have a seal right there to do it. So not only have you failed in your mission, but it is possible, even likely, that Akatsuki now has Saika in their grasp as well? How impressive, Kanori said sarcastically. You are the one who said Akatsuki wouldn't get involved. Ino shot back, her temper flaring. And I couldn't just leave Kushina to die. Couldn't you? Kanori asked calmly. I thought ninja were accustomed to death. What's one more in the pursuit of your mission? She was there to help me. To help us. Ino yelled, jumping to her feet. She wouldn't leave, but I tried to salvage the plan anyway. If Akatsuki hadn't interfered it would have worked out fine. And you could have used the Horatian to take her somewhere else before returning and finishing your mission, Kanori said coldly. You could have abducted the Jinchuriki before returning for the woman. You could have brought her fully into the plan and explained why it was necessary that she leave. You could have driven her away through words or actions and kept her clear of the mission. You could have Enough, Kushu said softly, his voice cutting through Kanori's building rant. Ino turned to him gratefully, slightly relaxing the defensive posture she had adopted when Kanori started tearing into her. Kanori just eyed him with a blank expression for several seconds before sighing in exasperation. Kushina's appearance was not something that any of us accounted for, including you, Kushu continued, his voice firm. You were the one who suggested this plan in the first place, and you know full well that Ino does not share your perspective on the situation. As it stands, Akatsuki's actions will make some of our other plans easier to implement. We will make adjustments for the other parts as needed. You mean I will make adjustments, Kanori pointed out, though she had calmed down. Very well. I will be sure to take her sympathies into account when constructing future plans, she added, sending one last annoyed glance towards Ino. In the meantime, I suggest you focus on recruiting Kushina to our cause. We will need additional forces on our side to compensate for Saika should she now be in Akatsuki's hands. Surely you can salvage at least that much from this situation. With that, she turned and stalked several feet away before dropping to the ground and adopting a meditative pose. Bitch, Ino muttered under her breath, crossing her arms and glaring towards Yagura's form. She occasionally forgets or chooses to ignore the fact that not everyone shares her perspective, Kushu commented as he reached over and began healing Ino's hands. You do realize how dangerous it is that Akatsuki may have gotten their hands on another Jinchuriki though, don't you? Of course I do. Ino protested. I'm not an idiot. She wilted, her shoulders dropping as she let out a tired sigh. You understand, don't you? I had to save her, Ino asked quietly, staring intently at him. Kushu focused on her hands for a moment before slowly nodding. I do. I would have done the same for you. Ino let out a bitter laugh. That doesn't work on me, little brother, she said wryly. You'd have done the same for me, but not for her. If it had really been you, she'd be dead right now, wouldn't she? Kushu looked up to meet her gaze and shrugged. Perhaps. Things would have happened differently, in any event. I might not have escaped from the blast, for example, or I might have taken a different path and never even encountered Kushina in the first place. Ino sighed and looked down at Kushina's form. Her skin had returned to a healthy pink, only her torn and burnt clothing and singed hair revealing the damage she had endured just minutes ago. She knelt down and gathered the sleeping woman into her arms carefully before looking to him once again. Just make sure she never knows that, she said quietly, before continuing more firmly. I'll meet you back in Kiri. She focused for a moment, then disappeared in a yellow flash. Did you notice? Konori asked, her eyes opening once more as soon as Ino departed. Of course I did, Kushu responded, knowing what Konori was referring to. She's using her Yuki instinctively and is applying it without even realizing what she's doing. Her image is also a lot more defined than it was before she left. She's starting to stabilize. It's happening much faster than it did for us. I wonder if it's a byproduct of her origin, because she has several templates to work from, or perhaps a consequence of spending so much time in close proximity to you. Does it matter? Since when has that stopped me? Kushu snorted in amusement as he nodded to acknowledge her point. What does this do to our plans? The timetable has changed significantly. Kumo will not take this lying down, and I'll need to make sure everything is ready for when they make their move. Send Ino to me in 3 days, at noon. I will need her assistance to move quickly. After that, she will need to make contact with Ryudo and his Jinchuriki. And then she returns to her village. It's not her village anymore, Kushu responded. She made her choice, remember? She made a choice, certainly, Konori replied. Then she made another one that resulted in the failure of the mission. He frowned darkly, but Konori continued speaking before he could reply. She is your sister, that I believe, and I do not say that lightly. It remains to be seen if she is our sister. We shall see how she handles her tasks in the coming days. Kushu nodded slowly, remaining silent as he considered what Konori had said. He watched as Konori rose to her feet, adjusting her clothing slightly as she prepared to leave. Remember, 3 days, at noon. I got it, he said in annoyance, waiting off the reminder. Konori gave a sharp nod, then turned on her heel and vanished in a shunshin. Kushu snorted in amusement at her abrupt departure. Konori never had much use for wasting time, and greetings and farewells definitely counted as such to her. He turned towards Kiri and left in a shunshin of his own, his mind turning to the now inevitable meeting with Kushina and the explanations that would be required. Scene break. Kushina woke with a gasp, instantly rolling to her feet and adopting a defensive stance. Her right hand darted over her shoulder to grasp the hilt of her blade and found only empty air. Her eyes swept over the room even as she adjusted her stance, her legs coiling beneath her and both arms rising in front of her, fists clenched and ready to lash out. She instantly recognized the signs of a Fuinjutsu workshop. She was quite skilled with seals herself, after all, even if she never had the passion and flair for it that true masters like Jiraiya and Minato had shown. This room could have melded seamlessly with the basement of her own home. Long tables lined the walls, covered in scrolls and papers and pots of ink, while notes were pinned over the walls above them. A pouch of kunai here and a spool of razor wire there only served to further confirm that this area belonged to a ninja. She shifted slightly, turning to take in the rest of the room, and found a large cleared space to her left, marked here and there with gouges and scorch marks, an area for experimentation and practice, no doubt. She was also underground, or at least in a tightly enclosed space. The lack of windows and the slightly stale air told her that much. She completed her scan of the room, finding only one obvious exit, a long set of stairs on the far side of the room. There was no one else present. A slight scuff from the stairway alerted her to someone returning to the room, and she moved swiftly and silently to take up a position near the bottom of the stairs. She noted that she was barefoot, dressed in clothing that was not her own, and that she had been stripped of any and all weapons and tools. She was not, however, bound or restrained in any discernible fashion. Her body felt only slightly stiff and her mind was sharp and clear. Her nostrils flared as the scent of warm bread flowed down the stairs, and the slight scuffs grew into barely audible footsteps. Whoever it was had a very light gait but wasn't making any real effort to hide their movement. The footsteps abruptly stopped. "Good evening, Kushina-san," a young girl's voice called out. Judging by the sound, she was still a good ways up the stairwell, far enough back that Kushina would not be able to reach her before she could react. She was also far enough back that the empty futon should not have been visible from the stairwell, which suggested the ninja had some other method of viewing the room. Kushina remained silent, waiting for the girl to reveal something, anything that would help her understand her current situation. She had no idea where she was or who was waiting for her outside of this room, but she was going to do her best to find out. "Naruto should be back soon, Kushina-san," the girl said then, wiping out all of Kushina's prior thoughts. Kushina stepped around the corner, looking up to find a blond-haired teenager carrying a large tray heavily laden with food and smiling down at her. She was wearing a loose purple shirt and black shorts under a short purple skirt and had her long blonde hair tied back in a high ponytail. Her eyes also noted the wiry muscles that danced just under the girl's pale skin and the unconscious confidence and grace with which she carried herself. Kushina had never met the girl in person but recognized her all the same. "Hello, Ino-chan," Kushina replied, some of the tension flowing out of her body. She didn't relax completely, though. It was possible someone was merely pretending to be Ino, though she was having trouble imagining what would be gained from that. Ino's smile widened as the girl beamed at her and resumed her trek down the stairs. Kushina's stomach rumbled loudly as the smell of the food grew stronger and she became aware that she was ravenously hungry. She pushed that aside for the moment as she focused on more important concerns. "What's going on?" she asked as she stepped aside to let Ino fully enter the room. "Where's Naruto? Where am I and how?" She trailed off for a moment, her body going tense as the memory of the paper swirling around her, leeching her strength away and clearing the path for the endless searing heat that had threatened to consume her. "How am I not dead?" Ino paused, flinching slightly, then continued walking over to one of the few tables that had chairs next to it. She set the tray down and pulled out one of the chairs before taking another one on the other side. "I know you've got to be starving, so go ahead and eat while I answer your questions," the girl offered, still smiling brightly at her. Kushina nodded slowly, rationalizing that the girl matched all the descriptions she had for Naruto's adopted sister and that she'd already been unconscious for an unknown period of time, more than long enough for any captors to introduce any poisons or other harmful substances into her system if they wanted to. That didn't stop her from reflexively inhaling deeply to try to catch any telltale scents in the food or subtly using one of Tsunade's techniques to test for some of the more common types of toxins. After so many years as a contractor, some things were just automatic to her at this point. Satisfied that nothing was amiss, she picked up one of the warm rolls and devoured it in 3 bites while Ino resumed speaking. "I'll start with the easy stuff," Ino said, her smile shifting to a knowing smirk as she watched Kushina wolf down the food she had brought. "Right now you are in the basement of the house we've been using the last couple of months. You were brought here after Naruto healed you to finish your recovery." Kushina nodded absently while noting that Ino hadn't actually said where this house of theirs was located just yet. "You escaped thanks to the oration." The Jinchuriki's attack was interrupted before it could dash. Ino's voice faltered a moment, her eyes going distant for a moment before she shook herself. "Before it killed you. Naruto has mastered the oration already?" Kushina exclaimed, smiling proudly. That made her son the second person to ever successfully master the technique, and the only one still living. A lot of her fears for his safety would be washed away with that ability at his disposal. Ino cleared her throat lightly. "Not exactly. The situation in Kumo wasn't quite what it appeared to be," she continued, her eyes shifting away as a small blush dusted her cheeks. Kushina studied the girl's demeanor, wondering why she appeared to be slightly embarrassed of all things. She waited for her to resume explaining, continuing to consume the fresh food that had been prepared for her while she did so. "Well, see, The thing is, Ino prevaricated for a few more seconds before letting out a low sigh and facing her directly. Naruto was never in Kumo. That was me. Kushina froze, shock and disbelief warring for control. The sandwich she was holding dropped back onto the tray with a dull clatter of dishes and utensils, and she swallowed thickly. You. That wasn't my dash. How could she not have noticed? What kind of mother was she that she couldn't even recognize when someone was pretending to be her own son? Was she really that? I'm really sorry about that, Ino babbled quickly, cutting through Kushina's thoughts. I didn't mean to trick you like that, but I didn't think I could just abandon the mission outright either. And, she hesitated for a moment, smiling nervously, and it really was nice to meet you. Well, I mean, sort of meet you even though I was Dash. What she means, another voice said, cutting through her babbling, is that she was doing her best to protect me. Kushina whirled to find Naruto standing behind her, a fond and amused expression on his face as he looked at Ino. His eyes shifted to hers, his smile softening a bit. Hello, Ka-san. She lunged forward, pulling him into a tight hug and just holding him as the last of her tension drained away. Her son was here and he was safe. Whatever else had happened, that was the important thing. She instinctively registered the feeling of the tailed beast's chakra that was woven through Naruto's own, providing a twist to the way he felt to her senses that she would never forget. Her brow furrowed slightly, though, as she recalled that she had felt that same sensation back in Kumo. It tore at her hard to do it, but she pulled away from Naruto and brought her hands up in front of her to form the ram seal. Her son watched her with a furrowed brow before his face showed understanding and gave her a small nod.
Kai!
Kushina called out, flaring her chakra and attempting to force any foreign influences out of her system. She paid close attention to the feeling of her own chakra and the muted sensations she felt from Naruto and Ino as she did so. There was an odd flicker in Ino's signature, but it vanished quickly. She repeated the technique twice more, this time not sensing any flicker at all, before she was convinced that she was free from any genjutsu or other tricks. She pulled Naruto back into her arms, letting her tears flow freely as she relished the knowledge that she had finally reunited with her son. It took her a few minutes to get herself back under control, but she eventually settled back down to resume eating while Ino finished relating everything that had happened during the battle with the Kumonin and Akatsuki. Kushina spent a little while in contemplation as she absorbed the new information, then turned to Ino. Thank you, she said, pouring as much sincerity into the words as she could, for protecting my son. Ino blushed and grinned at her, moving one hand breezily through the air as she waved off the praise. Don't worry about it. Somebody's gotta watch over little brother and keep him from doing anything stupid. The challenging smirks they sent each other was simultaneously heartening and painful to witness. Heartening to know that her son had such a good relationship with Ino, and painful that she hadn't been there herself to see it develop. What I don't understand, Kushina began, turning back to Naruto and shoving aside the pain with practiced ease, was what you were hoping to accomplish with this mission in the first place. Why would you risk either of you to infiltrate Kumo like that? What were you after? Naruto sent a significant look towards Ino, receiving a slight nod in reply before he turned back to Kushina. For you to understand that, he began, leaning back in his chair, I need to explain something that happened while I was growing up, something that I've kept hidden from nearly everyone. Kushina's focus sharpened as she turned all of her attention to Naruto. She'd missed far too much after that bastard had stolen Naruto from her, and she wasn't going to let any chance to get to know her son better slip by. I'd been living with the Yamanakas for a couple of years when I started having the strangest dreams. Dreams of places I'd never been, of creatures I'd never seen. It took me a long time to realize that they weren't dreams at all, but memories that belonged to the being that had been sealed inside of me. Scene break. The Raikage paused, keeping the bar fitted with 400 pounds of weight suspended above his chest as he turned to look at the ANBU who had entered the room. His ninja knew not to interrupt him while he was working out for no reason. He used the time to clear his head and focus on whatever issues were most demanding of his attention. "What is it?" he asked, resuming his workout. He lowered the bar until it just touched his thickly muscled chest, then pushed it back up in a smooth, easy motion. 52. We have received a report from Team Yujito, Reikage-sama. 53. And? Samui-san has assumed field command and has issued an urgent warning. His eyes narrowed slightly as he pondered why Samui would take over for Yujito. 54. A group identifying themselves as Akatsuki ambushed the mission and captured both the target as well as Yujito-sama. All members of the group were capable of flight at rapid speeds, so pursuit is impossible at this time. 55. Samui-san is returning with all haste, but advises that anyone wearing a black cloak lined with red clouds should be treated as actively hostile and as a AA-rank threat, at a minimum. His hands clenched on the thick iron bar and the low groan of twisting metal filled the room. Samui-san also reported that the missing Taki Jinchuriki was sighted wearing the same cloak, along with a missing nin identified as Deidara of IWA. The third member seemed to be the leader of the group, but does not match any profiles in the bingo book. A spike of killing intent flooded the office as the Reikage surged his feet, a snarl of anger on his face as he flung the metal bar towards the far wall. And through it, the massive weight tearing through the reinforced wall like paper and tumbling end over end to land in the courtyard below with a dull crash and a small explosion of dust and dirt. The Reikage himself began stalking back and forth in his office, his mind whirling as he processed this new information. "Get the team that was following that Chiaki shit," he snapped. "I want everything we have on him rechecked now. Light a fire under those idiots in the intelligence division and get them working on everything we know about this Akatsuki." ANBU began scurrying out of the room to follow his orders. "Samui and her team are to be escorted directly to me when they return to give a full report. After the dash." The Reikage froze as the full ramifications of this news finally penetrated. A group of ninja just pulled a kidnapping in the middle of his territory, making off with 2 Jinchuriki and, given the lack of mention in Samui's hurried report, apparently sustaining no losses while doing so. They used a third Jinchuriki to do it, one that had only been sighted briefly during the attack on IWA, making a run at Suna's Jinchuriki. None of his ninja had spotted anything directly, and the reports they had gotten from their allies had been very thin and light on anything more than vague theories. His own people had caught wind of attacks on Konoha and Suna reserves, but that was all. He knew from the IWA refugees he had allowed to remain in his village that, as far as any of the survivors knew, IWA really had lost their Jinchuriki years ago and that they had no part in the destruction of Taki. Given that there were quite a few older jounin and even the Tsuchikage's granddaughter among the group, he was inclined to believe them. If this Akatsuki had control of Taki's Jinchuriki, then that suggested that they were behind the attack, which also suggested that they had control of Iwa's old Jinchuriki as well, or at least the tailed beasts those Jinchuriki had contained. At least 3 Jinchuriki, 2 others, the Sanbai and Rokubi, unaccounted for and potentially in their possession, and 2 more just captured. This could be far worse than the scenario that had led the other villages to ally against IWA. Send messengers to the other villages. "I'm calling for an emergency Kage summit," he ordered, still thinking. And that didn't even consider the possibility that the Yamanaka Jinchuriki was actually serving as bait for this very purpose. Konoha's Jinchuriki had disappeared during the final hours of the attack on Iwagakure itself, according to Konoha, and had not been sighted by anyone since. Just like Konoha had provided the majority of the evidence regarding Iwa's culpability for the attack on Taki. And it just so happened that Konoha were the first ones on the scene for that as well. Most of the evidence would fit if Konoha and Suna were actually the ones gathering Jinchuriki as well. All of the false accusations and deceptions would allow time for Konoha to train up their new Jinchuriki. In fact, According to IWA, the Jinchuriki for the 4 and 5-tailed beasts had disappeared shortly after the end of the Third War, while the 4th Hokage was still alive to use his damnation. That would also make the Jinchuriki somewhere in their early to mid-teens, more than old enough to have the training and control necessary to be a real threat. If this Akatsuki was just a front for Konoha, then... And bring Kuratsuchi here as well. I think it's time for our guests to start earning their keep. Chapter 58, Bait and Switch, Part 4. Yujito remained still and silent as she regained consciousness, feigning a deep sleep and trying to assess her surroundings without giving away anything to her captors. The first thing she noticed was the fire. It called to her, resonating with the thing she kept contained, and she knew that with the smallest effort she could snuff it out or cause it to rise into a towering inferno. If it came to a fight, that would be her first avenue of attack. She took stock of her own body after that, quickly discovering that she not bound or restricted in any way she could detect. That, coupled with the easy access to fire, could mean many things, most of them bad. These Akatsuki ninja had clearly come prepared, far more prepared to face her than she had been to face them, though it galled her to admit it. She had been stuck in an awkward position, attempting to recapture Konoha's missing Jinchuriki while taking out the S-rank missing nin, protecting him and fending off another missing nin also after the prize. She had agreed to cooperate out of expedience, fully expecting her temporary ally to attempt to turn on her or at least steal her target. She had not expected the target himself to fling a lightning bolt that actually managed to hurt the form she had manifested. She hadn't been knocked on her ass like that since her last spar with Kurabi, and even it hadn't hurt like this had. She breathed in quietly, trying to get further information on her current position. Her nose told her she was outside, near a river, and the noise of shallow water running swiftly over rocks confirmed that. As she listened, there was the faint scrape of a pen on paper. There was at least one other person nearby, then. "You aren't in Akatsuki's hands anymore, you know," a woman called out calmly. Yujito considered maintaining her ruse for a moment, but the casual way the woman spoke convinced her that her potential captor was fully aware that she was awake. Her eyes snapped open, scanning her surroundings in the space of a moment. Then she mustered all of her considerable power and flexibility to push herself from her prone position into a long leap, landing halfway up the trunk of a nearby tree. She immediately started her odd ritual with the beast, pushing her chakra towards it in preparation of unleashing its fury on whoever threatened her. She held off on acting further, however, taking in the terrain that placed her somewhere in central Kumo. She could make out the mountains surrounding her village in the distance and the fact that there was only one other person in sight. It was a young blonde woman of middling height wrapped in a thick black cloak. She was pale and thin, but had a large bust and delicate features that would have drawn attention anywhere. Her most distinctive feature, aside from her chest, which could easily rival Samui's, she noted sourly, was the blue diamond tattooed on her forehead. The young woman kept most of her attention on whatever she was writing, though she did spare the time to give Yujito an amused glance. "Nice distance," she commented. "I have no intention of keeping you captive or in any way delaying you," the woman continued more seriously. "I will make no effort to stop you if you want to leave now. I'm sure you can spot your village from here, and could probably make it there in a day or two if you wanted. I would recommend taking this with you, however," she added, hefting the small stack of papers for emphasis. "And I should trust you?" Yujito countered warily. She flared her chakras slightly, testing for any signs of genjutsu and finding nothing. In fact, she couldn't even feel any scrapes or bruises or even general soreness that usually followed a difficult battle. "How long has it been?" she snapped, suddenly concerned that she had been kept unconscious for days or even weeks. "Since I rescued you?" "Roughly 10 hours. Given the situation when I found you, you must have been subdued minutes before that at most." Yujito frowned, glancing up at the sky. It was the right time of day, at least, and there were no obvious signs that more time had passed. "And you fought a powerful ninja to rescue me and then release me?" she asked skeptically. To rescue you? No. I thought you were someone else. Yujito tensed. And just who did you think I was? My friend. She was in this general area, and has every reason to tangle with Akatsuki. I'm hoping that you have some idea of where she is, actually. Would this friend be Kushina Uzumaki? Otherwise known as Sword? Which would make you Hammer? The blonde finally showed something other than calm amusement as her face grew both hopeful and wary. Yes. She personally killed several Kumo ninja who were merely performing their duties to their village, Yujito spat. Hammer grimaced, then her eyes narrowed. She wouldn't have done that without a reason. Would that duty of theirs have anything to do with capturing or otherwise harming Naruto Yamanaka? All missions are classified, Yujito responded flatly. That'd be a yes, then, the blonde sighed. She looked down at the papers in her hand, then placed them at her feet and stood. I have no quarrel with Kumo, but I also have no control over what Kushina may or may not have done in defense of her son. If you want to do something about that, despite the fact that I rescued you from whatever fate Akatsuki had in mind for you, then now would be the time. Yujito seriously considered it. She was confident that, however powerful a ninja hammer actually was, she could take her one-on-one, especially if she called on the tailed beast to do so. The calm, almost bored air the woman was projecting made her hesitate, though, and regardless of her reasons the woman had rescued her. Even among the most pragmatic of ninja, it was considered bad form to immediately turn on someone who saved your life. The woman seemed calm and reasonable, and she seemed to know something about Akatsuki and their goals. If she truly wanted to know about Sword's fate, then perhaps she would be willing to exchange information. If it became necessary, she could always attack later, after she had seen what Hammer would willingly part with or bargain for. You weren't personally involved, Yujito said after a few seconds of contemplation, making a show of relaxing, and you do seem to be responsible for my current freedom. I'm not about to forget what Kushina did, but I won't blame you for it. That's all I can expect, the blonde said, sitting back down. Yujito slowly approached, still wary of attack but also making sure she didn't give Hammer cause to think she was about to attack either. She finally settled on a small log across the fire from Hammer, ignoring the way the flames bent slightly in her direction. Hammer eyed the fire for a long moment, but made no comment as she resumed her work. How did you get me away from that Akatsuki ninja, anyway? Yujito asked finally, preparing to get as much information out of Hammer as she could. I took her by surprise and got in a lucky hit, Hammer replied evasively. The woman dissolved into paper and fled after that. Paper, is it? Yujito mused. She used paper wings to fly, it looked like, and commanded slips of paper with seals written on them as her primary form of attack. She also made a blade of paper that seemed quite sharp, Hammer noted. How would you rate her in close combat? Yujito pressed. S rank, she replied firmly. That high? Yujito asked in surprise. Your fight sounded like it ended quickly, and you took her by surprise. What makes you think she's that good? Hammer had a small frown as she replied, I hit her when she wasn't expecting it, and she's still alive. Yujito eyed Hammer warily as she considered that. She wasn't certain if the kunoichi was trying to make herself seem more threatening, or if she genuinely believed it would take S-class skill to accomplish that feat. Who are you, anyway? How did you end up working with Kushina Uzumaki, of all people? Hammer blinked at her, then smiled wryly. I honestly thought you would have recognized me on sight, she muttered. Guess I'm not as famous as I used to be. Used to be? Yujito echoed. You can't be more than 25, and Sword and Hammer have been showing up for over a decade. Hammer smirked. The name Tsunade Senju. Yujito couldn't help it, she openly gaped. Bullshit, she sputtered a moment later. Tsunade would be 50 years old by now. And she disappeared over a Over a decade ago, about a year before Sword and Hammer showed up. I'm well preserved, the woman replied smugly. She wanted to argue that, but focused her attention on other matters. You and Kushina Uzumaki, just what the hell happened in Konoha? Is this all tied in with the Kyuubi Jinchuriki? Tsunade's face darkened. His name is Naruto, she said firmly. I would think someone like you, more than anyone, would view the Jinchuriki as people. I'm perfectly fine with what I am, as is the rest of Kumo, Yujito snapped. There was that cult who went way beyond fine with it, but that was another matter. Didn't stop you from trying to capture one of your fellow Jinchuriki, now did it? I'm a loyal ninja of Kumo, Yujito replied. Piece of advice, Miss Nibi Jinchuriki, Tsunade said, leaning forward. A truly loyal ninja is going to value you for the beast you contain first and your status as a fellow ninja second. After all, the beast does more to protect Kumo than any one ninja, now doesn't it? Is that how things really are in Konoha? Yujito answered with a small sneer. I suppose your vaunted will of fire doesn't amount to much, if you value your comrades and allies by their usefulness to you rather than your bonds with them. Tsunade sat back, a contemplative look on her face as she studied Yujito. I'm not in Konoha anymore, now. Am I? Yujito was silent for a moment, then nodded. No, you aren't. They both lapsed into thought then, both watching the other silently. Eventually Tsunade set her pen aside and turned her attention solely to Yujito. What happened to Kushina? She asked. To the best of my knowledge, Yujito replied carefully, she escaped with the aid of Naruto Yamanaka. She frowned thoughtfully as she began to recall more details of the last moments before her capture. The Akatsuki Kunoichi mentioned something about the Hiraishin, she added, watching Tsunade's reaction carefully. So he got it to work after all, she grinned. The Hiraishin is back? And in the hands of a Jinchuriki who is wandering the elemental nations doing who knows what. Sounds like, Tsunade replied smugly. Any kid of Kushina's is bound to end up causing trouble somehow. Do you realize what that means? It means that Naruto is even safer than he was before, and that he's already put it to good use saving himself and Kushina. That's the technique that almost single-handedly crushed IWA. Yujito shouted, jumping to her feet. In the hands of a missing nin. A Jinchuriki missing nin. And? You think the other villages are going to just let that go? They can't let that go. He could use that to attack anywhere, at any time. Or, even worse, the technique could fall into the hands of a rival village. He was already hunted, just for the fact that he was a Jinchuriki, Tsunade commented idly, her expression visibly bored. His life has been in danger since he was born. All I've done is give him another way to keep himself and those he cares about safe. Since you're here and he and Kushina aren't, it looks like it's working out perfectly to me. What you have done, Yujito repeated slowly. You make it sound like you gave him the Hiraishin. Tsunade grimaced briefly, then returned to her bored expression. I helped him get access to it, yes. Which means you had access to it. Not at all, Tsunade replied. Through various circumstances, I had one of the keys, but not all of them, and I didn't have access to the safe. Yujito wasn't convinced, but didn't push for now. She would mention the possibility that Tsunade Senju and wasn't that going to create a furor all on its own, also knew the Hiraishin, and had openly confirmed that Naruto Yamanaka had access to it. What are your intentions? What is Naruto Yamanaka aiming to do? Why was he? Yujito trailed off, her eyes narrowing in thought. The Kyuubi Jinchuriki's movements had already been suspicious simply based on his travel speed, but knowing now that he had the Hiraishin and could use it, they made even less sense. And then there was what he was saying when Akatsuki showed up, and the way he tried to talk Kushina down. He wanted to get captured, Yujito muttered. She looked up at Tsunade accusingly, frowning darkly. With the Hiraishin, he could have escaped easily, and we wouldn't have known to even try to counter it, if we even could. He kept talking about Akatsuki, like he was, what? Trying to warn us? Tsunade looked thoughtful. I can't tell you what he was thinking. We've been looking for him since he went missing, just like everyone else. Kushina bolted at the first solid lead we had, and clearly managed to make contact with him. If he was trying to warn you, however, I think you'd be smart to listen. Yujito remained tense as she eyed Tsunade. You have to know that I can't just let you leave, now. You know far too much that could be critically important to Kumo. Tsunade smiled wryly and nodded. I figured something like this was coming. Look, Yujito said slowly, if you come with me willingly, and just talk to the Raikage, I'm sure we can work things out. You personally haven't done anything to Kumo, you saved me, and your information about Akatsuki could save lives. We might even be able to do something about Kushina if she agrees to stay out of Kumo territory from now on. We could possibly not actively pursue her, perhaps. Something, Yujito offered. How about everything I know about Akatsuki and your rescue in exchange for not putting a bounty out on Kushina? If individual ninja want to pursue their own revenge, well, it's their funeral. That might work, Yujito allowed, surprised at how accepting Tsunade was about this whole thing. Good enough, Tsunade replied, nodding sharply. You'll find everything I've got on Akatsuki written there, she said, pointing to the stack of paper at her feet, including speculation about their total membership, base of operation, everything. Yujito glanced down at the papers, back to Tsunade, then sighed. You're a clone, aren't you? Fucking Konoha and their fucking shadow clones, she growled. Tsunade shrugged, a wide grin blooming on her face. I didn't really feel like dealing with you if you woke up in a foul mood, she commented. The papers Real. Enough. Her face darkened as she fixed Yujito with a glare. I'm sure the might of Kumo could take the two of us out eventually, but I'd think about just how much damage we could do before that happens if I were you. This is a fight neither of us wants or needs, and I'm content to let it end here. If you really want to push us, well, my godson is a Jinchuriki who can use the Hiraishin, she added, her face twisting into a dark grin before she burst into smoke. Yujito scanned the area, checking for any signs of deception or impending attack, then sighed and rubbed her face wearily. This was far from her finest hour as a kunoichi, and she was probably in for it when the Raikage found out just how badly this mission had gone. Standing with a sigh, she gathered up the papers, scanning through them and noting that Tsunade had been honest as far as the contents went. She began to move away before pausing and looking back at the fire. The flames were stretching towards her, pulsing in time with the blood pounding in her veins and the suppressed anger that thrummed through her body. Her face twisted into a snarl as she slashed her hand through the air, causing the fire to tear itself apart into small sparks that swiftly burned themselves out. By the time the last spark faded, she had already vanished. Scene break. And after seeing those memories, feeling like they were my own. Kushu trailed off, an earnest expression on his face. I couldn't just ignore it, not anymore. It would have been like someone had abducted Ino and locked her away simply to steal her power. Kushina had a pained expression on her face as she slowly nodded. I told Ino about it, and she agreed with me. Then Gaara showed up in Konoha, and I had the chance to prove once and for all that the memories were real or not. He didn't have to fake the rage that rippled over his face. They were torturing him, he spat. She jerked in her seat, one hand reaching out towards him for a moment before it fell back to her side. Torturing Gaara, she asked hesitantly. He smiled wryly. Him as well, it turned out. But no, I meant the beige Gaara had sealed within him. There was no reason for it, no benefit to the village, just endless pain and agony while they stripped away his power. They abused Jinchuriki and Bijou alike, all because they wanted more power for themselves. Kushina's face twisted, a small bit of killing intent leaking out as her eyes grew distant. Yes, she muttered, that's what they do. They just take and take, not caring who gets hurt in the process. Ino shifted uncomfortably. They aren't all like that, she protested. Konoha didn't dash. Kushina's eyes snapped to hers, and Ino flinched back in her chair. Kushina blinked at the reaction before she visibly calmed herself. Konoha, she replied after a moment, took my son from me. They weren't nearly as cruel to him as other villages were, but don't pretend that they haven't taken their own steps to secure their power. His sister nodded reluctantly, and Kushina slowly relaxed. After fixing Gaara's seal, I knew we had to make sure the others weren't in the same situation. I tried various things, and was even making some headway in Konoha, but then the IWA invasion happened and Akatsuki made their move. They've already captured 4 of the Bijou, and they are openly using them as weapons to attack the other villages. They were after Gaara and I both, and nearly killed Ino when they attacked some of the Konoha reserves as a diversion. After that, I knew I couldn't afford to waste time playing with Konoha. I could do much more acting on freely than I could tied down by Konoha's rules and regulations. At the same time, I couldn't dismiss the advantages of having a village's resources at my disposal. Which is how I ended up here. Kushina frowned, her eyes narrowing as she looked around the basement again. You haven't said where we are, she pointed out. Kushu opened his mouth to reply, but stopped when he sensed Itachi and the Mizukage approaching the house. He glanced over at Ino, who met his gaze with a slightly worried expression. They're early, he muttered in annoyance. Delay them for a few minutes, he told her, and she nodded before standing and heading for the stairs. His container's mother looked on in confusion, but he pulled her attention back to him. Kaa-san, he said, there's still a lot to tell you, but there's some things you need to know right now. First, in order to get the people I'm working with to take me seriously, I had to convince them I wasn't just a Jinchuriki, I had to convince them I was the Bijou itself. Her eyes widened in shock. Why would they think that? I have all of its memories, which includes how to control its energy like it was my own, he told her, letting a stream of Yuki emerge from his hand. Kushina watched in fascination, and then smiled widely for some strange reason. Like mother like son, she said, pride evident in her voice. He didn't quite understand what she meant by that, but pushed ahead. The other is that I had a contact here, one I've actually known for a very long time. Despite what you may think, he is not now and never has been an enemy, nor has he ever had any ill intent towards me. Her brow furrowed. Why would I think that he did? Kushu laughed lowly at that. Because the contact is Itachi Uchiha. Kushina was on her feet the next moment, the chair she had been sitting in launching backwards to tumble end over end and slam against the wall. One hand reached over her shoulder to grasp at the air, while the other curled into a fist. He's here, she spat. He's an ally, Kushu insisted calmly. He tried to kill you. That entire scene was staged. Staged? Kushina let out in a strangled yelp. I got the report directly from Shizen-chan. You were mere inches away from death. Kushu shook his head before stepping forward to place his hands on Kushina's shoulders and fix her with a calm and serious gaze. I was never at risk. At no point did Itachi threaten me or inflict serious harm. That entire situation was set up to allow him to escape Konoha while drawing attention to himself and away from me. He has helped me several times in the past, and is at least partially responsible for allowing us to reunite now. Kushina's face crumpled, tears leaking from her eyes as she wrapped her arms around him. I missed so much, she whispered to herself. It's not your fault, he assured her, returning the hug. You're here now, that's the important thing. Her arms tightened, and they remained like that until he sensed Ino and their guests approaching the stairs. He gently shook her loose, letting her know that they would soon have company. She hastily wiped her eyes and straightened her clothing, dropping into a professional demeanor with surprising speed. So you don't have any reason to worry, Ino was saying as she walked down the steps. I disagree, came Meiterumi's flat reply. She was wearing her customary blue dress while her red hair spilled down her back and across her chest. Her eyes flicked around the room the moment it was in view, honing in on Kushina and narrowing. First you disappear after leaving the village, and then you return without passing through any of our gates or encountering any of our patrols. Not only that, but you have brought someone else back with you, again without prior warning. Itachi's reaction was much more muted, but Kushu caught the brief hesitation in his gait as he realized who was in the basement. His eyes settled on Kushu, narrowing slightly, and a small quirk at his lips suggested a frown. Is this going to be a problem, Naruto-kun? Itachi asked, stopping at the bottom of the steps while Mei continued forward for a few steps. I don't know, Itachi, Kushina growled. Kushu could see her muscles dancing beneath her skin as she struggled to keep herself under control. You ran away before we finished our discussion the last time. Ino palmed her face, sighing, while Mei looked back and forth between the two suspiciously. Do you know her, Itachi? She asked, the warning in her voice clear to everyone in the room. We have met, Itachi replied shortly, not moving from the foot of the stairs. He tried to kill my son, Kushina answered. Which was faked, Kushu reminded her. Mei's glance between them before understanding bloomed. Kushina Uzumaki, I take it? Her eyes drifted between them, her mind clearly working on how and why Kushina would still support him, despite his true identity. Kushina nodded tersely, not even glancing away from Itachi to acknowledge the other woman. So now you've brought a foreign ninja into my village, Mei groaned, turning back to Kushu. You have done much for us, Kushu-san, but there are limits to what I can accept. I need to know how Ino and now Kushina have managed to slip into my village undetected, and why. Your village, Kushina repeated, finally looking away from Itachi and taking in Mei's form for the first time. Meiterumi, Mizukage, she recited dully, clearly recognizing the woman now that she'd actually looked at her. She turned to Kushu. You've been hiding in Kiri? Yes, Kushu answered Kushina, then turned back to Mei. How exactly did you know Kushina was here, anyway? She hasn't been out of this basement since she arrived. Not even Itachi knew she was here yet. We have our ways, the Mizukage answered vaguely. How can you not know you were in Kiri? She asked suspiciously. Easy, Ino chimed in, grinning. She waited until Mei was looking at her before disappearing and reappearing next to Kushina. She took a shortcut. Mei slowly turned, her eyes wide and disbelieving. That was... She breathed. The Hiraishin, Itachi finished, finally moving deeper into the room. You knew? Mei asked, whirling on Itachi. He shook his head. I did not. I was not informed of this part of the plan, he said, his eyes lingering on Kushu and somehow conveying his irritation without changing facial expression or tone. However, what she did was not merely move quickly, but instantaneously move from one place to another. There is only one technique capable of that. Ino's grin grew wider. It's awesome, she agreed. I don't suppose you would consider sharing this technique, Mei said, her eyes studying Ino intently. Kushu let out a sharp bark of laughter, not even bothering to reply to that suggestion. So this was your grand plan? Sneak Kushina Uzumaki into the middle of my village using the Hiraishin? What was the purpose of all this? Hardly, Kushu replied. The plan was to retrieve either the Nibi or the Hachibi from Kumo. That was going well until Akatsuki interfered. Now Kumo has been attacked in their own territory, possibly losing a Jinchuriki in the process. Mei understood the ramifications of that immediately. She paled slightly and let out a slow sigh. And so Kumo has the excuse to mobilize their forces they've been looking for. And with former Konoha ninja involved, she added, nodding towards Kushu, they may just decide to take a swing at Konoha while they're after Akatsuki, assuming they don't just blame Konoha outright. And, Since Kiri has been sheltering Konoha's missing Jinchuriki, along with 3 other Konoha missing nin, there's plenty of reason to pull us into it as well if they wanted to. She let out a low chuckle, shaking her head. And I suppose your original plan would have been to come to me, either with a Jinchuriki willing to turn against Kumo or a freed Bijou, and call for Kiri to start moving as well. Now we have to respond, simply to be prepared in the event that Kumo turns their sights on us. She began pacing back and forth, one hand idly playing with the hair draped across her chest. If they truly have lost a Jinchuriki, the Raikage will move to get the other villages involved, simply to spread the risk out and cover more ground. They don't know about our alliance yet, and the longer we keep it hidden the better. Her eyes drifted over to Ino. Even if you don't share the Hiraishin, you now have a massive advantage in mobility. If the stories are correct, you need to have a kunai to warp to, yes? It doesn't have to be a kunai, Ino replied, shrugging, but I need something to attach the anchor seal to, yeah. Kiri can assist in spreading those far and wide as needed, in exchange for your assistance in certain matters. I think we would both profit from that, Mei continued. Ino didn't answer immediately, but she was clearly interested. Mei's eyes turned to Kushina, sweeping over her form carefully. Kiri has heard many rumors about the prowess of sword and hammer. To the best of our knowledge, you have never directly opposed us or our efforts, so I do not believe there will be any issues in working with you. Will Tsunade-san also be joining you? Eventually, Kushina answered evasively. Let her know that Kiri would welcome the opportunity to work with her, especially if she can contribute as much medical expertise as Kushu-san. I also note that you do not have a sword at the moment, Mei said, a small smile growing on her face. Have you misplaced it? It was destroyed, Kushina replied sourly, her hands clenching. I haven't had time to get a replacement. Kiri has the finest swordsmiths in the elemental nations. I'm sure you will be able to find a blade to your liking here. Or, she trailed off thoughtfully, her smile growing wider. Tell me, Kushina-san, what's your view of the 7 swordsmen? Scene break. Nagato stared impassively at Deidara as the missing nin finished explaining what had happened. The former IWA ninja had burns crisscrossing his arms and torso, with one particularly long, thin line running across his cheek and into a small, stubbly patch of hair on his head. His face had twisted slightly in pain several times throughout his explanation, indicating that either the burns or other wounds he had sustained were still bothering him. Fu was barely functional. She had trouble focusing for more than a few seconds before her eyes grew distant and a vapid smile appeared on her face. Fortunately, Deidara had developed a method of keeping her, if not cognizant, then at least placid. He would gently touch her every few seconds, stroking her hair or holding her hand or wrapping her in a brief hug, which served to draw her attention back to him. He then quickly retreated, calming her down as she began to take the contact as a signal for something else. She would soon begin to drift back into her haze, and the cycle would repeat. Conan had been the worst off, and hadn't even been conscious when they had arrived. According to Deidara, she had attempted to treat her own wounds, attached several seals to her body, then placed herself in a coma. Nagato had recognized some of the same stasis seals that had kept his arm from completely withering away when he looked her over. He was worried for her state, but had already ordered his ninja to take her to the hospital immediately. His initial plan had been to stay by her side as much as he could while she recovered, but Conan herself apparently had other ideas. You are certain, Nagato said slowly. Deidara met his gaze calmly, if a little nervously. Yeah, She made sure I got it right before she knocked herself out, The QB is capable of using the Hiraishin. Yeah, He let out a slow breath as he closed his eyes. Several seconds passed in silence, even Fu sensing the rising tension in the room and reacting to it by making herself as unnoticeable as she could. See to your wounds, and to Fu, he said finally, still not opening his eyes. Report back to me in 3 days. You may go. Come on, Deidara muttered, and there was a rustle of cloth and the soft echo of quiet footsteps. Nagato remained still for several minutes, his thoughts whirling as he tried to find any way in which this latest mission wasn't a disaster. They had openly attacked Kumo, failed to capture the Nibi, and all 3 members of the team were injured. None had died, fortunately, or suffered permanent injuries, he hoped, in Conan's case, but other than that it was a complete failure. And the Hiraishin, that technique, in the hands of the 4th Hokage, had brought IWA to its knees during the Third War, and that had been a very brief application of it. The true limitations of the technique were unknown, but the sheer mobility it gave to the user was an incredible advantage. And it was now in the hands of their greatest enemy. He finally opened his eyes and turned on his heels, moving at a rapid pace towards the more secluded part of their base of operations. The few ninja allowed in this area gave him wide berth as he passed, some blanching and paling as they caught sight of his form. He attempted to rein in his emotions, but ultimately paid them little attention as he focused on his destination. He came to a stop outside a large wooden door and paused for a moment to gather his self-control. When he felt he was ready, he knocked sharply and then pushed the door open. The interior of the room was a study in contrasts. Seal diagrams and notes were strewn about chaotically, splotched with spilled ink or crumpled into wads and tossed carelessly into a corner. Discarded clothing and bits of food and drink were mixed in as well, and there was a faint but persistent odor of stale wine. In the middle of the room, however, was an oasis of perfect order. A wide circular area stood clear of any debris or even dust, as if the accumulated mess was held back by an invisible barrier. Inside that circle was a large seal design, nearly 4 feet across, and every inch of it was covered in precise and intricate markings. Even without knowing the purpose and function of each, he could still appreciate the sheer artistry of its construction. Whatever its function, it was beautiful, and clearly the work of a master of his craft. The man responsible for that was currently bent over the design, his brush moving in sure, rapid strokes as he filled in another section. Nagato couldn't help the frown that crossed his face as he took in his former teacher's appearance. Jiraiya's hair was a tangled, unkempt mass of white that hung in thick clumps around his head and face. His distinctive clothing had been cast aside for a crumpled brown robe that hung loosely from his frame. His face had a slightly pinched look about it, as if he had not been eating well, and his face and hands were practically covered in ink. It was his eyes that worried him the most, however. Jiraiya's eyes burned with a feverish light, and his expression had a strange intensity about it that he could never recall seeing until the last few months. Jiraiya gave no sign that he had noticed his entrance, but Nagato waited patiently rather than disturbing the man in his work. After a few minutes, Jiraiya finally stepped back, setting the brush aside and wiping his hands over his face, smearing even more ink and sweat across his features. "Ah, Nagato!" Jiraiya called out, a smile crossing his face as he finally acknowledged him. "Come to admire my work?" "Not today, Sensei," Nagato replied. "Conan just returned." "Gotcha. So you need me to tweak the Nibi Jinchuriki's seal." Can do. I'll have to figure out just what seal they used, of course, but I should be able to pull out at least a 40% increase in available energy, and that's just dash. They did not capture the Nibi, Sensei. A dark look crossed Jiraiya's face. "It got away," he growled. "I warned you about the enemy's abilities, Nagato. You should have been prepared. You should have dash." "The QB knows the Hiraishin," Nagato interrupted before Jiraiya could get lost in his rant. Jiraiya abruptly cut off, his eyes bulging widely. It stole Minato's technique," he snarled. "How could it have the house?" "Minato's workshop." "Damn it, Tsunade. Why did you let it in? How could you dash?" "Sensei!" Nagato yelled, pulling Jiraiya's attention back. "Do you know the limitations of the Hiraishin? Do you know how it can be countered? Jiraiya looked at him oddly for a moment, like he didn't quite understand the question, then started nodding slowly. I helped Minato with that, you know, he said wistfully. That sealing array was when I first realized that he'd finally surpassed me as a seal master. Proudest moment of my life, like my own so dash he cut off abruptly, looking away. After a few moments, he turned back to Nagato. Yeah, I know the limitations. You have to have an anchor tag to travel to. That's it. That's the only limitation? Is there a limit to the distance traveled? Is the cost excessive? No limit on the distance, and according to Minato it's actually pretty cheap, comparatively. All of the real work happens in the seals, and there's no way to keep a seal from dash. He stopped abruptly, a stunned expression crossing his face. Then, slowly, he began to grin. He soon started laughing, the sound full of vicious delight and joy. Eventually he recovered, scurrying over to a desk and sweeping the accumulated off to the floor. He pulled out a clean set of scrolls and began scribbling rapidly, muttering to himself as he did so. Nagato watched him for a minute, then turned and left the room. Sensei rarely paid attention to anything around him when he got like that, and it would be some time before he snapped out of it. By the sound of it, he may have had an idea that could limit the effectiveness of the oration, so it was best to leave him to it. His thoughts turned to his next destination, one that he looked forward to even less than his visit to Jiraiya's workshop. The reasons were very different, however, as under normal circumstances he would have taken any excuse to spend more time with his son. It was time for his son to take up his role as a guardian, however, and he did not look forward to bringing his son into the world of ninja. Part of him had hoped this day would come in the distant future, or not at all. The failure of the latest mission and the knowledge that the Kyuubi, and the Bijou in general, were only growing more powerful with time meant that delay was no longer an option. He approached the rooms reserved for himself and his family, steeling himself for what he was about to do. He knew Konan would understand why he was doing this, why he had to do this, but she would probably like it even less than he did. He finally came to the room directly across from his own and pushed open the door. For once, the room was actually in good order. The books were placed on their shelves or stacked on the desk, Yahiko's discarded clothing placed in a basket, and no trash or other mess scattered around the floor. The only sign of disorder was the slightly ruffled appearance of the bed. His eyes finally settled on his son, who looked up from the scroll he had been reading and grinned widely from his perch on his desk chair. "Dad!" Yahiko called out as he launched himself forward. Nagato reflexively caught him, swinging him around in a wide circle before setting the giggling boy back on his feet. "Is Mom back yet?" Yahiko asked then, putting on his best pleading expression. "Not yet," Nagato replied. He would wait until Konan was in a more stable condition before letting Yahiko know about that aspect of the situation. "Ah," Yahiko muttered, his face falling. He recovered quickly, though, and looked back up with a wide smile on his face. "Are you here to play with me?" "Not this time, Yahiko," Nagato said. "I'm actually here to—" He trailed off, noting the way Yahiko's lips were twitching as he fought back a smile. "Yahiko," he said sternly. His son burst out laughing, stepping back and spinning in delighted circles as the sound filled the room. "I got you, I got you, I got you," he chanted. "Yahiko," Nagato began again, "what have I told you about doing this outside of training?" "Not to." Yahiko giggled, hopping up and sitting in midair. His small form began rotating sideways, spinning in small circles as he orbited Nagato. His hair shifted from the light blue of its normal hue to a deep red much like Nagato's own, then shifted back upon it was predominantly blue with dark red streaks. "Stop playing, Yahiko," Nagato commanded sternly. "I am here to talk to you, man to man, ninja to ninja." "Of course, if you can't behave." Yahiko's form vanished abruptly. Nagato blinked and shook his head, taking in the suddenly messy state of his son's room, the discarded clothing scattered around the floor or shoved in one corner and the books and papers strewn haphazardly on his desk. The covers of the bed were on the floor instead of only slightly ruffled, and he could make out what looked like a technique scroll poking out of the pile of cloth. The boy himself scrambled out of his desk chair, looking just like the illusion that had managed to completely fool him.
I can behave,
Yahiko said quickly, coming to a stop in front of his father and adopting a serious expression.
See?
The real me, front and center. Nagato dropped down to one knee, placing his hands on his son's shoulders and regarding him seriously. I have talked to you about your duty as a guardian before, have I not?
Yes,
father, Yahiko replied soberly. One day I'll be working right beside you and Mom and Funechan and Kyoko and I'll make June proud of me, he finished, his expression falling for a moment. Nagato squeezed his son's shoulder comfortingly. I'm sure June was already proud of you, he told him. He often told me he couldn't wait for you to join the Guardians as well. Yahiko nodded silently, sniffling for a moment. In fact, I think you're finally ready, Yahiko, Nagato continued. His son's face lit up, and he smiled warmly. There's a very important mission that only you can do. In fact, we're going to fight back against some of the people responsible for June's loss. Are you ready to help me with that, son? Yahiko nodded rapidly, a fierce expression on his face. I am, he said firmly. Nagato pulled him into a sideways hug, smiling down at his son's eagerness. With your help, son, we'll make sure June can rest easy knowing that his loss was avenged. Scene break. Kiku Yamanaka smiled and waved as her customer walked out of her shop with her purchase. The small bell placed above the doorway jingled happily as the door swung closed, leaving her alone in the store for the time being. Her husband was in a meeting with Shikaku, the new Hokage, which was gradually getting less and less strange as time passed and Naruto and Ino were. She bent over the counter, her eyes squeezed shut and her hands gripping the edge of the scarred wooden surface so tightly her fingers turned white. She'd promised herself she wouldn't do this. They were alive, they were safe, they would come home in time. Naruto wouldn't let anything happen to Ino, and Ino would keep Naruto grounded and focused. Hatake-san and Hinata-chan were looking for them too, so it was just a matter of time. They were alive, they were safe, they would come home in time. Kiku drew in a ragged breath and quickly wiped her eyes before straightening. She was just glad that no one had been in the shop to see her momentary loss of control. She'd told Inoichi that she was handling the situation just fine, and she'd be damned if she gave him any reason to worry about her in addition to their missing children. She focused on straightening up the area behind the counter, filing away receipts and sweeping up fallen petals and bits of dirt. After a few minutes, the bell above the door rang again and she looked up to greet her next customer. It was a young girl, maybe 13 or 14 years old. She had straight brown hair that fell to her shoulders and lightly tanned skin. Her pale blue sundress hung from her shoulders to past her knees, the bottom swirling around the girl's calves as she turned to push the door shut. Her brown eyes scanned the shop slowly, taking it in with an odd intensity before finally settling on Kiku. Welcome to Tanaka Flowers. I'm Kiku Yamanaka, Kiku called out, smiling softly. The girl just stared for several seconds, then a wide smile bloomed on her face and she stepped forward. You have a wonderful shop, she said. Thank you, Kiku replied, her cheeks dimpling. Is there anything in particular you were looking for? I was looking for something for my mother, the girl said. I haven't seen her for a while and I wanted to get something nice for her. How sweet! Kiku said, focusing on the customer and pushing aside the thoughts her story stirred up. I would suggest an arrangement of white anemones and dark red carnations, both of which we currently have available. The girl nodded. That would be beautiful. One of my friends told me that I should get an arrangement of irises and white chrysanthemums, though. Kiku nodded thoughtfully. We have those as well. Does your mother follow the meanings of flowers at all? She asked. She loves flowers, the girl replied, so she must. Why? Well, the arrangement your friend mentioned would mean good news and truth, which is certainly a nice sentiment. However, white anemones represent sincerity and dark red carnations represent deep love and affection, which would mean a great deal to your mother coming from you, I think. The girl nodded thoughtfully, bringing up one hand to tuck her hair back behind her ear. I see. I guess there's a lot more to this than I thought. I see why my friend suggested those, but I really like the meaning behind your arrangement, too. The girl scanned the shop for a moment. I'd kinda like to get both, actually, but I don't get to see my mom as much as I'd like, but I want her to know that I'm safe and happy despite that. Are there flowers for something like that? Kiku thought for a moment. Well, nothing that specific, but dash. The doorbell rang again, and she turned away for a moment to greet the new customer. Her smile widened when she realized it was her husband returning early from his meeting with Shikaku. He waved and smiled back as he shut the door, then turned to nod at the girl standing next to her. Then vanished. Kiku gasped and whirled as she heard a soft thump behind her and turned to find her husband pinning the girl against the wall, one arm pressed against her throat and holding her off of the ground while the other held her wrist and was twisting and extending her arm in what looked like a painful manner. Dispel the hinge, he ordered, his voice cold and harsh. You're good. I didn't think anyone would catch that. Still, you're overreacting, don't you think? The girl wheezed out, making no move to resist. An unknown ninja approached my wife while concealing their identity. Be glad I haven't killed you already. Now, I won't ask again, dispel the hinge. He accompanied his words with a sharp twist on the girl's hand, and Kiku felt a little sick when she clearly heard the dull crack of bone. And then gaped in shock when the girl burst into a cloud of smoke. Inoichi stumbled forward for a moment, but quickly righted himself. He stared at the rapidly dissipating smoke for a moment, then turned and moved towards her. He pulled her into his arms, one hand stroking her back soothingly while the other cupped her cheek. Are you all right, Kiku? They didn't do anything, did they? Kiku felt herself shaking slightly as she processed what had just happened. No, I mean, yes, I'm fine. No, they didn't do anything. She was just ordering flowers for her mother. I didn't even realize she was a ninja. She didn't do anything strange or threatening at all. Good, Inoichi breathed, his arms tightening for a moment. Good. They must have wanted something, though. What exactly did they say? Before Kiku could reply, a masked and cloaked ninja appeared next to them. She gasped in surprise, noting absently that she hadn't even heard the bell ring. Yamanaka-san, the Hokage requires your presence immediately. What? I just left Shika a minute ago. Besides, my wife was just dash. Immediately, Yamanaka-san. The Hokage was quite specific. I'm not leaving my wife alone, Inoichi snapped. The ANBU paused for a moment, then nodded. She may come with us, or you may drop her off somewhere along the way. Nonetheless, I must escort you to the Hokage as soon as possible. Inoichi calmed down slightly, then turned to look at Kiku. I'll be fine, and Shikaku isn't one to use words like immediately on a whim. Just drop me off with the Akimichis, she said. Akimi should be at home, and there are plenty of ninja around should something else happen. It's on the way to the tower anyway. All right, Inoichi nodded reluctantly. Scene break. The door opened with more force than strictly necessary to admit a visibly irritated Inoichi Yamanaka. His gaze honed in on the hooded figure sitting across from the Hokage, and he paused a moment to gain control of himself. Reporting as ordered, Hokage-sama, Inoichi said professionally, taking up station across from the desk. Thank you for coming, Inoichi, Shikaku said, his eyes locked on the figure sitting across from him. I knew you'd want to be here, and your insight will be invaluable. Inoichi's brow wrinkled slightly, but before he could ask anything the figure spoke up. Come on, Shikakuji-san, you don't need to be so uptight, the figure said, sweeping back the hood of the cloak and revealing her blonde hair tied back in a ponytail. She turned a beaming smile to Inoichi as she bounced to her feet. Hey, Tu-chan! He just gaped as Ino pulled him into a hug, grunting in surprise when her powerful arms squeezed tightly. Ino giggled as she stepped back. Her grin turned into a smirk as she raised her hand and wiggled her wrist back and forth, shaking her head in mock disapproval. I told you were overreacting, Dad. That was you? Why would you have to hide your identity from your own mother? He paused, his expression growing more wary as his gaze sharpened. No hinge this time, she said, settling back into her seat. She then shook her finger at her father, saying, just don't go breaking my wrist again, or I'll have to make another clone. It's her, Ichi, Shikaku said calmly, or at least a shadow clone of her. A shadow clone? Her dad asked dully as he turned back to her. Why would you since when do you know the shadow clone? Naruto knows some very interesting people, Ino replied evasively. Inoichi paused, glancing over at Shikaku. Ino, we know about what Naruto really dash. He is not a what? Ino snapped angrily. I know exactly who Naruto is, and I've known longer than either of you have. Whether you call him Naruto or Kushu, he's the same person he's always been. Ino, her father began again, his hands raised placatingly, I know how much Naruto means to you, but dash. There is no but, Tu-chan, Ino interrupted him. He's my little brother, and that's all there is to it. Or are you going to try to ignore the years he lived with us, all the time we spent together? How about the time he saved my life? I'm not ignoring any of it. Inoichi shot back. But he was lying to us the entire time. He used us. Ino smiled wryly. Of course he did, Tu-chan. Just like Konoha used him, like the ninja use all of the bijou. You kept him trapped and sealed away, and would have been perfectly happy to throw away the key if you could get away with it. Do you expect him to just accept that? No, we don't, Shikaku interjected smoothly. And the Sandaime was taking steps to work with Kushu, a process which I attempted to continue. I had the impression that we were well on our way to establishing a solid foundation for a strong relationship between us, when he and you just disappeared during the middle of the attack on Iwabikure. Ino grimaced. I'm afraid that was my fault, sort of, she admitted. When Akai's Jinchuriki attacked the outpost where I was stationed, Naruto was busy fighting off Orochimaru at the time and couldn't help or even respond. If I hadn't managed to escape, I would have died. As it was, I was really hurt and in very bad shape. She shook her head in exasperated fondness. He decided that he had to focus on keeping me safe rather than working with Konoha, at least until I could handle myself better. And so he left, and took me with him. That's his excuse for going missing, Nin? Shikaku asked flatly. What could he have done to keep you safe out in the wilderness that he couldn't have done here just as easily, if not more so? Ino smirked. He might object to being labeled as a missing Nin that assumes that he was serving Konoha to begin with. As for what he did, this and that. To hear him tell it, Konoha was getting very nosy about his activity, and there are some things he didn't want getting out. Would that have something to do with the fact that you currently have more than 3 times as much chakra in a shadow clone as your real body could have held just a few months ago? Shikaku asked pointedly. Her smirk widened into a proud grin. Little brother does good work, was all she said, however. Ino, you aren't here to return to Konoha, are you? Inoichi asked quietly. Sorry, Tu-chan, Ino replied gently, giving him a sad smile. I'd love to spend more time with you and Ka-chan, but Naruto needs me. We're your family, too, Ino. Her lips trembled and her smile wavered for a moment, but she quickly mastered herself. "Yes, you are, and I love you both," she said fiercely. Her expression shifted, growing calmer and more confident as she added firmly, "What I am doing with Naruto is going to keep all of my family safe. I can't do that if I stay in Konoha." "And just what are you doing, Ino?" Shikaku asked. "What did you return to Konoha for, if you aren't going to stay?" Ino turned to face Shikaku directly, squaring her shoulders. "Hokage-sama, as the designated ambassador of the Free Bijou to Konoha de Kurano Sato, I am here to discuss the terms of a treaty between our peoples and an alliance against our common enemy, the criminal organization known as Akatsuki." That's the end of this tale. Thank you for watching, like and subscribe. Check out my other stories here, and with that being said, peace.